Hello Avatar fans, and welcome to the next episode of the Avatar Online podcast. This is going to be our next Rise of Kyoshi special. Specifically, this is going to be part 3, and this was the final part of our main discussion of Rise of Kyoshi. This time we'll be covering the final third of the book, which is chapter 22, all the way up until the end. So this starts with the chapter that is called Conclusions and ends with the chapter called Hauntings, which is the last chapter. So, this is the official podcast for the fan site, AvatarTheLastAirbenderOnline.com, and I'm going to be your main host, Morgan, Airspeed Prime. Joining me on the podcast is Greg2B from the site.
What's up, everyone?
Excellent. So, we've got a little bit of news to get through, but it shouldn't take too long, and then we'll get straight into the Rise of Kyoshi. So, let's start off with something we mentioned, I think 2 podcasts ago, and that was that the death battle video that was kind of previewed for the upcoming one, which was going to be Aang versus Edward Elric from Full Metal Alchemist, and we talked a little bit about that. Since then, the video has actually come out. We have the winner and so on. We've seen how exactly the video is played out. Usually these can be a little bit controversial when they come out with regards to like fan reactions from either side and stuff like that. This one I felt went fairly by the books. I haven't really seen any controversy in this one. I think most people agree with the winner, and I haven't seen anyone really arguing that it should have went the other way. So I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say, okay, so they had Aang as the winner, and I suppose we can discuss any of the details that we want to hear, but in general, Greg, what were your thoughts on the video and the result that they went for?
I think it makes sense. We pretty much said the same sort of thing, just with how they were going to sort of, I guess, do their power scaling and comparing them to each other. I think, they did a good breakdown of their powers, and they made it seem like, it could be like, somewhat of a decent fight, which, the actual way that the fight itself was actually, pretty good, showing their various sort of like abilities and stuff like that. So, I think it worked for that. I don't think it was, like you said, that big of a surprise overall. And I think, like you said, most people are on board with, the actual sort of winner of the fight. I think, some people, they just wanted the other character, Ed to win just because they like him in general. But I don't think the power scaling was as much of an issue per se, other than I think some people just was a bit sort of curious about just the sort of matchup in general, I think.
At least in my interpretation, like I felt like even the way they did it, they were like a little bit generous with regards to like Edward's kind of power level in terms of just like how big he could be like all the time with his moves. In that, if I remember the show correctly, at least like he could do that like occasionally, but it wasn't like he was just able to do that like full stop, like they sort of had him do here. So in that sense, they obviously had to create more of a story out of the end fight, whereas I think if you were just determining the winner based off their powers, it probably is kind of Aang a little bit more easier than even the kind of story battle they had here play out. But it was pretty interesting. They obviously, these type of videos, the way they do is that they spend a decent amount of time just getting you up to speed on both of the characters, just in case anyone isn't familiar with either series and so on. And I think they did a pretty good job on both of them. Like, they went really in depth, and I think most of the information was correct, and so on. So yeah, I think they did it like. There's obviously some bits where it's obviously a little weird, and they're trying to bring the numbers into things. Like with the comics, they like measured it, and like the amount of Earth that Aang moved is this big. Ed survived the blast of dynamite, that's this much, and it's kind of like it's kind of difficult to measure those against each other when like a lot of the time it just comes down to like plot, like the character needs to move this amount or they need to survive this blast, rather than like Ed, even though he's just a human, is like that durable that he can survive an explosion and so on. But in general, I thought I was fine with the way they did it, and yeah, like we've discussed, no one was really arguing in the reverse from any sort of real logical opinion. It was pretty much Aang all the way, and they of course had him win kind of using the Avatar state in the end. That kind of finished the fight, but I think even if you excluded the Avatar state, I think Aang still, you'd have to give him the victory. But still, it's pretty cool. Honestly, I probably would say that the Toph Gara one is actually still more of an interesting one to discuss. But I don't know, do you have any final thoughts on the death battle?
I think I think that one might have been interesting just because the power sets are, I guess, more aligned versus, sort of Aang can pretty much use all the elements and everything else. I mean, he doesn't have metal bending, so he couldn't do anything with that, which probably worked really well in the favor of Ed in this battle because he doesn't have that ability. But yeah, no, I thought it was interesting overall. They did like a couple other videos where they broke down some of the sort of like behind the scenes and how like it's really like one of the like it just happened to be one of those matchups that was like very highly sort of like requested in general. So something that they had always sort of like thought of like sort of making and waiting till the time where they could actually do like the fight sort of animation sort of just and whatnot. So there is some sort of like backstory behind them even sort of making this and sort of the other matchup that they always which would sort of be sort of a gag matchup, which would be sort of Aang versus Captain Planet and seeing how that would work out, but it would be in sort of like a completely different sort of type of fight rather than sort of a more serious one. But no, I think it was overall for what it was and when it came out, I think it was pretty cool.
Yeah, like I suppose if you think of Full Metal Alchemist, like probably the better fight is like Zuko versus Roy Mustang, just because it's like fire versus fire. But that'd be more interesting. But yeah, next, and I suppose final piece of news is that I actually got my copy of Legend of Korra and Avatar's Chronicle a few days ago. I have a review up on my YouTube channel if anyone wants to see it and stuff like that. I think it's one of those ones where I really can't recommend it all that much, so I probably would suggest people go check out the video because I basically show off like most of the pages in the book in the video, so you can see just like what is and I suppose is not there in the book. It's about what I expected, really. I think we talked sort of off air about our expectations for it, and like they weren't very high. And yeah, actually reading through the full book, there's really not a lot here. It is pretty much just a recap from Korra. The fact that it's set so close to the end of the series, just in the middle of Turf Wars, means that there's no period of reflection to go on here. It's just Korra recapping pretty much events that have kind of just happened to her, and there's no new information. They do an okay job at, like, I suppose the framing device of this book kind of being Korra making this journal, getting people to write letters so she can actually like paste the letters into this sort of scrapbook, so you get the like letters from all the different characters. And in that sense, like the writing, it all feels like it's written by the individual characters, but because there's no new information, there's only so much you can get from it. There's a few fun little things throughout it, like on like the Mako page, one of the inserts is this little note with Mako's cool police sayings, and it has the three from the show, of course. Um, when you get to jail, tell them Mako sent you. But then it has all these other ones that are clearly brand new, like you're getting Una locked up and stuff like that. But other than that, it's just him kind of reflecting on his time at the police force. Similar with the whole Bolin thing, his page has a picture of him as Nuktuk on it. And the pullouts, especially this time, aren't even that good, I think, as well. The best one probably is the kind of hero shot of Nuktuk and Ginger from Nuktuk Hero of the South. And then everything else is kind of a little bit like they really didn't know what to do, and that like there's a random recipe card on the Genora page that is actually just what seems to be like a real world recipe for like coconut macaroons, and that like it has the temperature and like Fahrenheit and stuff like that. Like the page with Lynn has a pretty low quality. It's just kind of very light cardboard, like circular cutout of like a metal bender police force kind of logo slash badge, and a similar thing on the Red Lotus page, but with the Red Lotus symbol. And then other than that, it's like a tiny like 2-page booklet that has some pictures of spirits in it, and a kind of blueprint of the Dragonbird humming suits from like the end of book 4. There's just no new information here, I think, is the main problem. There's lots of new art in the book, which I think is probably the main reason to get this, in that the artist that they have here, Sora Medina, I actually really like her art throughout the book, but there's just, in the text, there's not a lot here, and considering that the book is relatively expensive for what it is, it's like just over 20-ish euro, I think is what I got it for, and then it's around the same price in dollars. It's one of those books where it's like, wait to get this on sale if you're at all interested, but this really isn't a book that many fans need. So I don't know, Greg. Do you have any thoughts on Avatar's Chronicle, or just this style of book? I don't really remember. Did you even get Legacy yourself, or what?
No, I have not gotten Legacy. I don't know. I mean, in theory, it sounds interesting. Like it could be, a cool thing to sort of have. But if with it just being sort of like a recap of the series and having, just basically just sort of new art. I mean, it essentially seems like it's almost just sort of like another, art book, just that it has, more text in it than the typical sort of art book, or just about the same. So I don't know. I mean, it sounds like it could be cool, but it's not. Doesn't have enough extra for me to actually want to get it.
Yeah, like there is a lot of potential in that. Like there's a page where it's like Zuko, and it's a really nice image of Zuko, but the letter that he sends back to Korra is, it's so clearly an example that the book, all the writer had to go on was pretty much the one or two scenes that Korra and Zuko shared together, and they had to sort of piece together like something Zuko would say after the fact based on the like one or two scenes that they had together. And this is a perfect example of like Zuko should want to go to the spirit world, but he's just kind of talking about like, if you ever see Iroh again, tell him what he talked to you about and stuff like that. Whereas like this could have been a tease for something more, but it's probably the biggest example that like Mike and Brian I don't think are involved at all in this book. Maybe Brian a little bit on art direction, but like there's no, I think, story involvement whatsoever here. In that like the Kuvira page doesn't hint at all about Runes of the Empire stuff. Um, the page with the Red Lotus doesn't give any extra information on them, in that it really does just treat the group as four people and doesn't talk about them individually. Yeah, the art is nice, but there's really not a lot to say here. There's a few like fun lines here or there, but there's not a lot to say about it beyond that. Like there's on the Janora page it says here, but I still hope to take Kai, or as my dad likes to call him, that close friend of Janora's who is also a boy, to the spirit world. So little bits and pieces like that where the writer is good, but they don't have anything to work with, I think, is the big problem here. And it just makes me confused and even more worried going into the next one of these books, Legacy of the Fire Nation, which is going to be the Iroh sort of scrapbook that he's making for Zuko. In that, like, I'm so worried about, like, the Lu Ten page, it's just going to be this kind of mashed together page with the vaguest information about Lu Ten with nothing to go on. So I hope that they find some way to make that interesting, because it's going to be so weird going into the history of the Fire Nation and them not mentioning like the stuff from, like, if they don't mention the stuff from Smoke and Shadow, I think there's a problem. Like if they don't mention the Komura stuff, the first Fire Lord, that information that we got, and then Fire Sage type stuff, that's going to be very, very weird. But I don't know. After, I suppose, two in a way sort of failures of books, we're going into that book that sort of everyone's interested in because it involves Iroh, but there's so much hype about Iroh that I think this book could be the most disappointing of them all. But I don't know. Did you have any hope that the third one will actually deliver where the other two didn't?
I don't know. It doesn't really seem like. I mean, I know we're always sort of asking about sort of like more information on Iroh and sort of like his history and everything. But I mean, if from what you're saying about these ones and how they've been going so far, I mean, I think this is, like you mentioned before, this is a case where they really need to get the creators involved in it, and at least just a little bit, just so that it actually feels like it has enough to go on with the whole sort of like larger story that they're going for, especially since now we're getting these books and the comics and all this stuff. Like there is sort of like the expanded universe that these books really could sort of like tap into, and sort of make it worthwhile for people to actually get or to learn the information that's in it. But right now it doesn't really seem, it almost seems like it's a separate sort of like, I mean, it is, but like, it's not even in sort of like the same sort of sphere of sort of these books coming out. It's just like on its own, just Inside Editions doing their own sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's weird because it sort of feels like the ideas would have had to have come maybe from one of the creators. Otherwise, like, why is it so sort of limited in scope? And that, like, if you're just doing a data book with some art, why not just do it that way? Why feel the need to try and make it sort of in universe and stuff like that? Just cram as many facts in there as possible and just have it be filled with like pull outs and all this sort of stuff. And this book especially, I think, suffers from really trying to be kind of too personalized and just having really, really vague pull outs and stuff like that. And that one of them is like the become an expert airbender in 30 days or less with words and pictures by Milo, and it's just the idea of like, ooh, fart bending, he has his lemurs, and that's all it is. It's just a random page. Whereas of the two books, I'd say like Legacy is still the one to get if you want to get one of these two books. In that, in Avatar's Chronicle, I don't really think offers anything, whereas Legacy at least has some interest because the pullouts are actually okay there. But that's the news. I think the Legacy of the Fire Nations is not out until February next year, so we've got a bit to wait, but it's not that far off, I suppose. So yeah, we'll get into our main topic for this podcast, and that is our kind of, I suppose, finishing up the Rise of Kyoshi discussion. Part 3 here, we're going to cover the final third of the book, Chapter 22, Conclusions, all the way up until the end. So where we left off last time, we were basically, Kyoshi had just kind of revealed herself as the Avatar. She started her training with everyone about how to learn the kind of other elements. Her relationship with Rangi is going very well, and she's also been doing some assassination, killing lessons with Lao Ji, and we're beginning to get some hints about, Lao Ji and his age, what he talks about with regards to like chakras and stuff like that. So, yeah, all of this is in preparation for the raid that is coming up. That's what they're preparing for, of course. And we start here with Chapter 22, Conclusions, which is a Jianzhu-centric chapter. And we basically follow him as he investigates what the Shirshu found from before. So this is from a few chapters ago, chapter 18, I think it is, the Beast, or chapter 19, the Beast. And basically what happens is that the handlers of the Shirshu get a notification to Jianzhu, and he goes out to Hujiang, where this all took place, to follow the Shirshu. He explains that, in a reference to previous chapters, he doesn't want to take a carriage on the road because the roads are so bad, so he gets eelhounds, a whole herd of them, and he and some guards head out there. An attack happens almost immediately upon them arriving, and the guy who brought them there is killed by arrows because, of course, the Dao Fei are still there. He attacks back and kills people. We get some pretty brutal earthbending here as he starts just impaling people with earth and so on. We see that when they get into the town itself, the guy from the arena who Rangi defeated is actually in there. He tries to get information out of him, but ends up having to kill him. And then when he comes out, he realizes that one of the guards that he's traveling with is actually working for Chamberlain Hui. So he's a kind of traitor to him. And he finds out that what the guard had sent in a hawk back to Hui was the idea that the Avatar has been captured by Dao Fei. That is what both Jianzhu and now Hui both think has happened to the Avatar in all of this. And that chapter ends with the idea that Jianzhu is about to take out even more of these loose ends by having to kill all of the guards that are with him. So he's just becoming all the more willing to kill and do what he needs to do to silence any information getting out. But some information has gotten out here. But Greg, what are your thoughts on this chapter, Conclusions?
Yeah, no, you can definitely. I don't know. It's interesting seeing these Jianzhu sort of focused chapters and getting his sort of like mindset of everything's from sort of, I guess, more of a mature person who's sort of like experienced. And I mean, he's clearly our antagonist at this point here, but just the way that he goes about doing things, to his, sort of like brutality and sort of fighting these people, and just sort of his whole idea of finding this place, I think, is really interesting considering his whole history and how he's been basically, at least according to him, been like the one who's been keeping the Earth Kingdom, the Earth Nation sort of together, sort of find this sort of like outlaw town and to find just his, what he thinks has happened to the Avatar here versus what us as the viewers knows has happened. I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, I like the really to call back to the eel hounds. I think is really cool if you remember that from the show. So it's nice to see them sort of integrate that into this story here. Even the little part where he's sort of like examining the area where you could think, maybe he's sort of checking things with sort of like a seismic sense or anything like that, I think is cool. So no, there's a lot of good parts to this chapter, I think, even if it is with sort of our enemy character.
Yeah, there's a few other details, like it's actually revealed that a few of the eel hounds died on the journey. It gets across, like, when you don't have a sky bison, how long it takes to travel across these places, and that they have, I think it's like 8 eel hounds or something like that, and they kind of rotate between them. and one like breaks its leg and they have to take it out. Um, the other thing would be, like you said, the sort of seismic sense and some of the new techniques that Jianzhu uses. He uses earthbending on the ground to uh, keep footprints in place, which I thought was an interesting one. He like solidifies
Yeah.
the earth around footprints so they can track them very easily. That was a pretty cool technique. This is where he learns about the Autumn Bloom Society as well. That's the one bit of information he gets out of the arena guy. He's never heard about it before, and then yeah, it's his first time also hearing about the town of Hujiang, and he's shocked to hear that there's a bandit town basically so close to Ba Sing Se, and he sort of, for someone who cares about what information he has so much, it really kind of pains him to have to find out about this all of a sudden. But yeah, that's chapter 22. We move on to chapter 23, which is called Questions and Meditations. So this is a kind of Lao Ji focused chapter here, obviously with Kyoshi. We see that they've arrived in the town where in or around where Governor Tay is, and basically Lao Ji continues to have Kyoshi think about, why she should be justified in killing Governor Tay for everything that he's done. She's now seeing directly up close the effect of his actions and what they've had on the people, of like how expensive rice is to buy and how large his stocks of food are, and how he doesn't ever give any of it to the people. She tries to like argue back about some of this stuff, but ultimately reflects on her own past and that the people here are eventually going to become like she was so close to, just hungry and desperate. And in the end, she's really considering like what he's saying here in all of this, and so on. As they, it's just him really challenging her on this thing of like, why do you want to kill Jianzhu, who helps so many people, but you want to spare Tay, who doesn't really help people? We also see Kyoshi getting some training here. It's revealed here that she can't do the dust step technique. It's not that she just flat out can't do it at all. She just can't seem to get the details of it being kind of light enough, it being strong enough to land on and keep going. But later on, it is revealed that she's kind of putting on a little bit of an act here to trick Lao Ji a bit. But Lao Ji uses Kyoshi's failure here to get him put on the same team as her going into the raid. As we also see Kyoshi meet up with Rangi and Kirama to sort of talk to them in secret, and the scene is just them sort of scoping out the mansion that they're about to invade. But the idea is that they have a longer conversation afterwards to plan things out in a lot more detail, and we'll get the results of that in chapter 25. Yeah, that's the core of this chapter, and then it ends with the scene with Lao Ji and his age. He's the one to bring it up to Kyoshi, not the other way around, and it's a funny scene because it's almost so simple the way he kind of talks about it. He just brings up the idea of like, you and your mother are the only ones who have never really asked about it. Everyone else would. And she kind of jokingly asks him, teach me the secret of immortality. And he just says, it all comes down to maintaining order, keeping things neat, clean, and tidy. Aging is really just your body falling apart on the smallest, most invisible levels and neglecting to put itself back together. With the right mental focus, you can take an inventory of your own body and place each little piece that's not where it should be back into the correct order. Kyoshi says, the way you describe it, you'd have to decide on what version of yourself you'd be stuck as forever. Exactly. Those who grow, live, and die. The stagnant pool is immortal, while the clear flowing river dies an uncountable number of deaths. And then he talks about the mind being so important, and people lack the focus in that, and that's what he's kind of trying to teach her. So here is a vague but clear-cut explanation of this kind of how to extend out your life. But in general, Greg, what are your thoughts on chapter 23?
Yeah, no, I think him sort of breaking down the way that, one could live forever, I think is pretty interesting. I mean, clearly it's something that you need like an incredible skill, and not everyone can do it. But it's interesting that, here he basically sort of offers it up to Kyoshi and, puts it in a way that, makes it seem almost sort of straightforward if you have the sort of mental ability to sort of do it. So I think it's interesting that we do that was something that we always sort of was asking about from this book, like would we figure out how Kyoshi would be able to live so long. And it's really cool to see that, not that it's like super sciencey or anything like that, but you do get, an idea of how it would work in this sort of world, which with the context of everything that, with bending and chi and chakra and everything else that, the people of this world can do, it seems like something that's in world is possible, considering that, it just seems like benders in general are able to live either really long or able to be, fairly active even in their older age. I mean, we always talk about Boomy and the things that he's able to do, and him being sort of like, one of the best earthbenders at his age is like, an amazing feat to behold. So no, I think that's definitely pretty cool to see, and just this whole chapter in general, just how they're sort of like reflecting on things and how, they're sort of getting Kyoshi more into the training and, her sort of, what she shows as her ability versus what she can do, and just sort of the whole idea of them sort of scoping out the place that they're sort of going to attack, and the whole, the conversations that they have. I think it's interesting how, they Kirima and Rangi are talking here, and they sort of mention about sort of like how this attack on sort of this place, and how, in the Fire Nation Academy, she, was prepared or was, sort of trained on how to attack all the other sort of nations as well, which I think is interesting considering, what the Fire Nation eventually does. So clearly those plans were actually sort of put into place. But no, I think this chapter is definitely pretty interesting. There's not anything sort of super crazy, but I think it has a lot of detail in it, considering, the last part of the book does have like generally a lot of action in general.
Yeah, you mentioned like Rangi's training there, and then there's a interesting thing that seems to be sort of foreshadowing of that, like they do even get trained on how a potential attack on Ba Sing Se would go, and how she notes that she would hate to be one of the soldiers involved in that attack, and I don't know if it's meant to be directly referencing that, like, this is more or less the attack that like Iroh will later lead, and that may be why what happens to happens to Luten, because it has to sacrifice soldiers against the walls. But it's a nice little hint at foreshadowing, at the very least, that the Fire Nation are thinking about things in that way, how to attack anyone, basically. But we move from there onto chapter 24, The Face of Tradition, which is the last chapter before the raid actually happens. And this is basically just the meet-up before the mission. They're going to see Mach and the Autumn Bloom Society just before they actually start the raid. So we first get introduced to the Kang Shen sect, who are basically the fanatics and the people who are going to be on the front lines as they head into the frontal stage of the assault. And they're described as non-benders who do these sort of rituals to apparently make themselves immune to elements, with the idea that apparently a lot of this came from people who had their loved ones like killed by benders, and they came up with these things to protect them from bending, and that's why they're here, to support Mach. And these are the guys who are basically going to be killed at the start of these battles, as Kyoshi notes. Any earthbender on the walls blocking these guys are just going to take them out at ease. When they do meet up with Mach, he's immediately asking about like, wait, you guys left very shortly after the Shirshu attack. Does this have anything to do with like Rangi and Kyoshi, the new people on the group? Lex kind of speaks up again, and we have another incident where the guy Wei is about to attack him again, but Kyoshi this time is prepared for it, and she actually defends Lex by breaking Wei's finger in a pretty awesome scene. And then the final part of this chapter is just the group, the Flying Opera Company, putting on their faces, putting on their makeup before they head into battle. So this is their white and red makeup, that's the group's colors. And Kyoshi is putting it on here for the first time. Wong specifically is the one to put it on for her, and just describes that the white of the makeup is meant to represent the sort of treachery that is so prevalent around the world, but the red is meant to represent sort of honor, and because they put it on their eyes, it's the way they sort of see their kind of brothers and sisters of the Dao Fei. So that explains Kyoshi's makeup, and Kirima puts the headdress from her mother on her. So this is Kyoshi in pretty much her full Avatar Kyoshi get up for the first time, and it's noted by Rangi that she looks beautiful, but by Lek that she looks terrifying, and that's the setup. Everyone's prepared now for the raid to actually take place. But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, no, I think this is definitely pretty cool just to see. I think it's interesting just to see in this short period of time how Kyoshi's changed, how, she's the one to sort of stand up for like in this sort of situation here, and how that's sort of like, it sort of puts them in a good place, but there's still, some suspicion on them just because of how they were sort of like left so quickly after the Shershu attack. But no, I think this is definitely, just the idea. I mean, the chapter's name is just, it's the perfect, naming for this, just sort of the face of tradition, and sort of how now we sort of see sort of the full idea of sort of Kyoshi's sort of face and her sort of outfit that she's been known for so far. So no, I think this is definitely, it's not a detailed or a long chapter or anything like that, but it's good sort of like in between the show, sort of what's to come.
Mm-hmm. And then we get into chapter 25. It's a longer chapter. It's called The Raid, and this is where a lot of the action, we've obviously been building up to this for quite a while, in that this is the whole Autumn Bloom Society. This is the Flying Opera Company repaying their debt by being a part of this raid. And we pretty much get straight into it. We get a further explanation of why Lek is called Bullet Lek, by an explanation of his like bending assisted, like incredibly accurate rock throwing. So he's taking out a lot of the guards on top of the main wall to start off the attack. But pretty much Mach kind of ruins the stealthy aspect of it immediately. The idea is that like he has his group attack before they're even finished doing the initial stealth stage of the plan. So we see Lek initially miss his second shot, but then he uses bending to like alter the course and hit someone. We also get the idea that the first wave of the acolytes is just getting like mowed down on the front lines by Tei's Earthbender guards. So a lot of people are actually dying. But it is revealed here in all of this that Kyoshi's plan with Kirima and Rangi primarily, but the rest of the group is more or less informed about it, is to actually keep Mach away from the palace, because if he gets in, he's just going to kill all the people there. And that's kind of what they were talking about in one of the previous chapters, about how Kyoshi doesn't really want to kill Tei, but she also doesn't want there to be a lot of bloodshed in this as well. She's kind of okay with this being a thing where they go in there, get the guy out, but she doesn't want everyone to be killed. So this has to be a plan where basically the Flying Opera Company do all of the work. They both hold back Mach's forces away from the palace and get the guy out. So how they do this is that basically Kyoshi's plan is that, as she said to Rangi and Kirima, it's only revealed in this chapter though, the plan is to use Kyoshi as the avatar here. So she's actually going to use multiple elements in the plan. And the first stage of that is to create a moat in front of the wall. That's the only defensive thing that's missing. So she and Lao Ji together make this giant kind of trench in front of the wall to keep Mach's forces from attacking. This prevents further deaths on the front lines. Then they go to the pond that's nearby, and it's revealed that Kyoshi did actually do some waterbending training with Kirima. But not a lot. So she's doing the power section of this. The full moon is out, so she basically levitates the lake of water in its entirety up, and Kirima keeps it sort of stable. And then they drop it on top of the palace as a way to basically knock out all the guards, but not kill anyone. And in all of this, it's basically just revealed that there was so much more planning that went into this attack than even we saw. It's like revealed during this chapter. So what are your thoughts on the first stages of the attack plan and all these sort of secret parts of the plan being revealed here?
Yeah, no, I think the first part is definitely pretty cool. Just the idea that, what is a castle missing is missing a moat, sort of all around it. And that's sort of what they're able to create with Kyoshi's sort of like, overpower, OP bending. She's able to sort of just create a huge trench, initially, just by herself, sort of like, I guess, running around, and then eventually she gets helps from Lao Gi to sort of like, speed up the process to create the whole sort of moat around it. And then just the idea that she is able to sort of, just be the force to sort of hold, this huge body of water up, while Kirima sort of like, they mentioned her like sort of just like plugging holes and stuff just to keep it from sort of like going all over the place. But, just the fact that they're able to sort of use this, in the previous chapter, they mentioned sort of like, what would you do, if you had the Avatar to help you, in this sort of raid, like, and, considering that and sort of her abilities that she just seems to have overall, not even just sort of like, because I don't think she actually goes into the Avatar state for any of these specific skills. It's just sort of her, just sort of, her bending prowess is just able to sort of do these sort of feats. And they're just, it's really, it just gives you a whole another set of things that you can do when you have someone who just has that sort of power here. So no, I think it's definitely cool to see how this plan that we didn't really know about fully comes to realization here, and how the rest of the group is really sort of seems like they're on board with doing this. You can see they're really sort of working as a group, and it's working out pretty well. At least right now.
Hmm. There's a little mention in all of this that obviously they basically levitate water out of a turtle duck pond, and they kind of explain that this is like the Earth Kingdom nobles like copying the Fire Nation royal palace with the turtle duck pond and kind of going overboard with it. So yeah, we pretty much get like Lao Ji then and Kyoshi kind of separating from everyone. This is where the assassination is potentially going to happen. They quickly like get their way through all the people, and they find that as expected, I think they talked about this in the previous chapter, Tay, when an attack came in, would lock himself in his safe room and leave everyone out, and so all the kind of other servants and stuff like that are on the outside. They basically spare their lives, they let them get away, and then just have Kyoshi sort of use her firebending to like break through one of the locks, and they get in, and it's revealed here that Governor Tay is actually just a teenager. He's only like 14, nearly 15 years old. And this is sort of where like Kyoshi immediately turns to Laoji and is kind of like, you knew that this was the case already, and that's why you were, trying to really heavily justify all of this and so on. And this kind of just has Kyoshi basically double down on the fact that she doesn't want to do this. She'd already decided, but this doubly makes her not want to do it. She won't kill Tay, but she still has to deal with the fact that this is the person that Lao Ji wants to assassinate. So she sort of has to trick him here, and this is where she reveals she can actually do some airbending as she sort of blasts Lao Ji away to find a little bit of time for her to escape with Tay so she can have him get away. This is where we get a little cutout to basically, again, prior to all of this, more secret training. This time it Rangi actually helping Kyoshi to at least to basically just quell her fears about her, superstitious stuff about the Avatar state. She wants Kyoshi to do at least one bit of airbending before she starts properly training with Kirima. This is just something that Rangi wants Kyoshi to do for her, just to ease her mind, and we just get the idea that they do the sort of circle walking together. And then when they have a nice little kind of cute moment, it is revealed that Kyoshi did manage to create this sort of kind of gust of wind. So she can use some airbending, but has basically no training in it. That's how she's able to do that. Then it's revealed she can actually dust step, and that was a big part of the deception with Lao Ji, to hide the fact that she could do that. And then when she has a little bit of time here, she just demands that Tay open his storehouse, become a better governor, and just improves, basically. That will be her sparing him, and if he goes back to his old ways, she'll come after him. He does basically realize at this point she's the Avatar, because he's seen her bend multiple elements, but he's not overly sure. He's just kind of confused. But anyway, he leaves on like an ostrich horse to just leave to safety as all this happens. So let's cover this Governor Tay situation here. What are your thoughts on this kind of reveal that he's actually just this kind of teenager, basically?
That's just, it's definitely interesting. I mean, I guess, it seems kind of fitting just the way that they sort of have been doing things, and just, I guess, just sort of how the book is geared in general, that, a lot of our main characters are either young or in that sort of age range here. So, it's definitely an interesting reveal. And I mean, like you said, Kyoshi had already sort of decided that, she wasn't going to kill him, that, it's not something that she's comfortable with doing. Not that she isn't sort of willing to do that, as you see later on, but just sort of in this case here, and especially seeing this, it's not something that she wants to do. But the fact that she's able to sort of get away with it, by withholding some of her abilities. You can definitely see that, just in this short period of time, she's progressed quite a lot. So, her bending masters have definitely been worth it for her to sort of have and her to train, even if they're not sort of on the right side of the law. She definitely has learned a lot just by being able to sort of like eventually figure out how to do dust stepping, and to do it with someone, with while carrying someone, I think is pretty cool. It definitely shows you her ability here. Not that she really got away from Laogi for that long particularly, and he probably could have caught up anyway, but he sort of just lets her go sort of at one point, even though he pretty much like appears like right behind her, like soon after the governor sort of gets away. But no, I think it's definitely, it's interesting just to show sort of her mindset of things and how she's decided to do things at this point.
Yeah, because there is an interesting discussion here in that Laoji still tries to convince her that, like, okay, even though he's really young, he's still, like, old enough to, like, know if he's doing something right or wrong. So, like, it still would be justified. Things would improve if you killed him. And but like he at this point kind of says like I was just doing things the way like my father taught me, and Kyoshi can kind of understand that perspective, and so she basically just has the approach of like she believes that he can change, especially now that she's threatened him, shown him this kind of basically given him an order of like help your people. There might be some hope for him, and she's kind of willing to accept the kind of results of what will come from this, even if it's bad. And it's it's not the last Laoji scene, but it's one of the last kind of important ones with regards to like how he views kind of Kyoshi and killing and stuff like that. And it is interesting to look at it because in the aftermath of all of this, he is honestly like annoyed and frustrated with Kyoshi that like she's kept him from killing his man, as he says. But he could have interfered at any point. Like the idea is he's that skilled enough that he basically, if he wanted to, could have defeated Kyoshi and taken out Tei if he wanted to. But he sort of lets Kyoshi do what she wants and just has her accept the result of whatever happens. So there's always this element of like he's teaching her, but he's letting her take the lead in a lot of the situations, and just having her learn from experience in a way. So he's a weird kind of guru-like teacher, and just with regards to his approach, because he's not the Iroh wise character or Guru Patik wise character where like everything he says is like the objective truth. There's so much like opinion, and because he's an assassin, he has a very specific view on things that not everyone's going to agree with, and clearly Kyoshi doesn't have the same opinions as him. But I suppose this arc here of just like the assassination lessons for Kyoshi and Laoji, what are your thoughts on them overall, of just like what he was trying to kind of teach her the entire time, and going up to this point where he's frustrated with her decision here, but lets her make it?
Yeah, no, I mean he does let her make it, but he does make it pretty clear that anything that Governor T does from this point on will be sort of on her head. It'll be her issue to deal with, and she does mention sort of like her ultimatum to him as far as she'll come back and get him if he does anything sort of wrong. So it would be interesting to see what this young governor does in the future. We do know about him sort of what he does later on as far as reporting this whole sort of incident, which is interesting. So maybe he hasn't quite sort of figured things out yet. But as far as the actual lessons here, he definitely is a interesting sort of teaching, just the way that he sort of views the world and tries to sort of like instill it in Kyoshi, which I think you can tell she definitely takes a lot of what he says to heart, even if it doesn't quite go along with what she views the world being. But I think with what we see her do later on and what we know of her, she definitely has incorporated it into some degree into the way that she acts as an avatar in general. So I think it's interesting just to see his reaction to this, how he mentions that he's sort of his first sort of pupil that he actually sort of likes sort of of course sort of goes against him. So it's interesting how that sort of played out.
Yeah, like in a way it's almost a situation where like what's ended up happening is that he's like thought her almost kind of inadvertently the right way to sort of view things as the avatar, and that he's basically been trying to point out to her, like, don't just kill people because you have a personal grudge against them, like she wants to do with John Zhu, but like think about like when you encounter someone, like if they should be killed and like if that would help things or not. And she's making her decision here that Tay, he should be allowed to live, he should be allowed a second chance because he's so young. But as we'll see in a second, she's going to encounter someone else who she's going to make the decision based on what he's done in the past and what he's going to do coming up next. I have to step in here and do this. And so she basically comes around on the kind of way Liu Ji wanted her to think, just in a kind of slightly different kind of view. He even gets annoyed at the way she approaches that, but she was always going to not just be the assassin type character. But anyway, there's still a little bit of chapter 25 left. So the group does manage to get the prisoner and take him out. So they hand him over to Mok. He takes off the hood that was hiding his face, and it's revealed here that the prisoner, who's been in there for like 8 years, is Zhu Ping An, the former leader of the Yellownecks. And all of a sudden, immediately, he takes over. Mok is no longer the leader. Zhu Ping An is in charge. The Autumn Bloom Society just all take out these kind of ribbons and put them around their necks, and it's revealed that the Yellownecks are back, basically. They're in full control here, and because barely anyone was killed in the attack because of what Kyoshi did, their numbers are still fairly big in all of this. So this is one of those reveals where, if you remember back to the early parts of the book and all the stuff with John Zhu and the mention of Yellownecks in like the early chapters, this is a huge reveal here that this has happened. Like, you know that name and what it means. But even now, they immediately get across the idea of just like they've helped. They thought they were just getting a fellow Daofei brother out, but they've got out probably one of the worst criminals in the world is effectively what they've done. So they're going to have to watch what they do here coming up next. So this is just the start of a bunch of really interesting sort of like twists and surprises that happen in the book. And this is, I think, one of the ones that really, really did surprise me. I was just like, oh, I've heard that name before. And then I remembered, yeah, Yellownecks, that's pretty bad. That's the whole John Zhu thing, what he had to put down, and now they're back. But what are your thoughts on the end of this chapter?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely is a cool reveal, especially if you can think back to the Yellownecks, just sort of how, sort of like important that was with Tortuga, and just sort of the whole, Jiangsu's just sort of history, or, sort of the rumors, or how he got one of his names, the Gravediggers. So it's definitely, a bit of a surprise to the characters, and even us just sort of seeing this person that has such a history in this world sort of come back that, seemingly no one thought was around.
Mm-hmm. Next, we get chapter 26, which is called The Challenge. So Kyoshi and the group immediately discuss what has just happened, that the Autumn Bloom Society was just this cover for the remaining Yellownecks, and that they have their leader back. So what do they do? Kyoshi decides that, okay, we'll watch them and see what they do. Like, are they just going to go back to the way they were in the past? Because we've heard these terrible things about what the Yellownecks would do to basically anywhere they encountered that abided by the law. And as they watch him from the air, they kind of do some surveillance. They realize that, yeah, straight away, they're just going to the nearest population and are just going to start kind of massacring people. Liu Ji does actually mention at this point in time, like, his interpretation of what he saw, like the last time he saw the results of like the what the Yellownecks did, and he says like stacking people on top of each other, in terms of like them being dead. They don't really describe it too much, but just let you kind of think what that means. So Kyoshi knows that she immediately needs to act. So when they arrive to challenge him, basically, they've already sort of beaten up this family. They're about to kill the kind of father of that family, and Kyoshi knows what she has to do here. So she challenges Zhu Ping An to a Lei Tai challenge, the kind of Daofei arena, the traditional arena. And she basically says, the reason I'm challenging you is because, I hate your entire existence, effectively. It's an interesting one because Zhu is actually fairly nice and polite to them because they've obviously just saved him. He kind of just says that, like, it's hard to get on my good side, but you're ruining that by doing this. So he's giving her like an out if she doesn't want to do this, but this is what she has to do. So she has a final conversation with Lao Ji before this happens, and he's kind of Kyoshi thinks like, wait, you don't want me to like kill him or what? What's going on here? But Lao Ji is actually like, no, you should have just killed him then and there. What's with the challenge? Like you should have just taken him out right then. And it's like, oh, that's what Lao Ji's character is. Like it just kind of just that one line got it across. He doesn't like this sort of honorable kind of approach that she's taken here. But she does say, I'm doing this as the Avatar, not as a Dao Fei. This is what I have to do for the world. And so, yep, they get onto the arena. It's made of earth. They're allowed to use bending in this battle. They both stand either side of the arena and prepare to fight. Kyoshi's just about to attack when suddenly Zu attacks first, and he uses lightning generation. And everyone's taken completely by surprise because, as we'll find out, lightning generation is effectively this borderline unheard of legendary ability at this point in time. So it's even more rare than it is in like ATLA, where they kind of describe it that like some of the royal families sort of know it, some of the noble families know it. Here they get across the idea that it might just be like him and maybe like one or two people in the past who have used lightning generation. So this is a huge shock. It's a surprise. Like it's not even been mentioned before this that Zu is a firebender. You expect him to be an earthbender. So amazing surprise right at the end here as Kyoshi's just like hit full force with lightning. But what are your thoughts on this chapter, the challenge?
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think it's really interesting how they sort of start this whole chapter off, just sort of with Kyoshi sort of taking to the air, sort of taking like the earthbender approach of going with sort of like neutral Jing and sort of scoping things out until she really has to sort of like jump into action and sort of, challenge Zu sort of head first here, after she's sort of seen, what they've done, to this sort of household here, and she really can't sort of step back here. And, even before this, sort of the whole group is sort of with her in this sort of thing. So this is where you can really sort of see that this is sort of like her really sort of like her group of friends as far as, being friends of the Avatar. So I think this is really cool to sort of get that moment here. And just sort of having Kyoshi sort of, challenge Zu to this fight, and this sort of, she's using sort of the customs of the Dao Fei, but she's also doing it, via her own sort of way of doing things and seeing what's sort of like, right in the world. So I think it's really cool that they get that point across here with everything that sort of has happened in her past, and sort of she's really coming into, I guess, sort of her avatarness at this point.
Yeah, it's a good point with the loyalty of the rest of the group, that even though they know they're up against this massive other Dao Fei group, even just the few of them that they have there, they all do stand on Kyoshi's side of the battle here as they head into things. They do describe it as like 500 people on one side of the arena, like 6 on the other. It's pretty crazy. But yeah, then chapter 27 is called Jews. So this is obviously the actual fight as it's going to progress here. So Kyoshi just continues to get like hit multiple times by lightning over and over again. They describe at the very start that her hands immediately get very, very badly burned from getting hit. I think they basically say that because the lightning hit her fans, which she was holding, that's more or less like what burned her hands almost like straight away. So it does also describe here though that after the first hit of lightning, the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh aren't having as much of an effect on Kyoshi, and she kind of explains that maybe it's because she's wearing the chainmail armor kind of hidden in her clothes and stuff like that. And she's just continuing to get kind of pummeled here, and obviously everyone is freaking out, and especially when she hears like Rangi, crying, watching this happen. This is what causes the Avatar state to activate. It's Kyoshi kind of realizing that her relationship with Rangi is causing Rangi to feel so much pain, and that causes Kyoshi to go into the Avatar state. So she basically bursts out of the lightning, grabs Zu by the collar, drags him into the air. She basically sets the fields around everyone on fire. It's this giant air vortex that she has him on, and we get some Avatar state voice action here. You forget, Zu, there's always someone who stands above you in judgment. What will you do now, knowing that your every step will have consequences? And his response to that is to try and breathe fire on her, but she blocks that and then just drops him. Basically, that's how she kills him. She just drops him from this massive height, and it's just explained that they have to, take his body away. And they basically, the remainder of the Elenox run off because of this. They've just seen the Avatar kill their leader. Wei is actually even like very respectful towards Kyoshi once he realizes this, and he runs off. But Kyoshi, in the aftermath of this, does collapse from the injuries from the lightning and especially the burns on her hands. So very, very cool moment getting to see the Avatar state, and especially like the font that they used in the Avatar state voice. It got across that effect really well. And yeah, Kyoshi killing him here, I think, is what they've been building up. It's what all the Lao Ji scenes have been building up to. Is this is someone who she felt completely justified in killing here because of what she's heard about him in the past and then what he was about to do immediately upon being released. So, she basically gave him the out of like before the challenge even came in of like, you're free, that should be enough, but it wasn't enough for him. And she just throughout all of this notes that some of the worst Dao Fei, just that sense of kind of justice, that they are kind of above everything else, is a terrible attitude to have, and that it's something she's going to have to keep her eye on going forward. But what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is definitely, a very cool chapter. Just sort of seeing the full sort of like Avatar state sort of moment here, and to see sort of, what we think, sort of, I guess, is her sort of like her judgment, her first sort of like, I guess, really big sort of thing as the Avatar, even though, most people probably won't know that this was her sort of behind doing this thing. But I think this is definitely like really, it brings everything that she's sort of had to think up throughout the whole book to one center point here, sort of, trying to show mercy, but, seeing here that, this sort of person just wouldn't accept this. So yeah, no, this is definitely a big moment for her.
From there, we move on to chapter 28, Memories. It's revealed here that Kyoshi has been unconscious, basically in and out of consciousness for 3 days. She's actually at Mistress Song's house, who is revealed to be the burn expert in the Earth Kingdom, one of the best. And so this is a clear reference to the Song that Zuko meets and stuff like that, who like obviously they help Iroh, who's like poisoned at the time. But I think the connection is meant to be there for sure. Yeah, so this is where we get the idea that Lek is the first one to meet Kyoshi when she wakes up, and she immediately like kind of thanks him for saving her during the raid and so on, and asks, "How did you learn to throw so well?" is her question to him. And he explains his backstory with his brother Chen, and how obviously he's from the Siwang Desert, specifically this place called Date Grove or Date Grove near the Misty Palms Oasis. They used to like occasionally just steal kind of like like out of date nuts or whatever the exact description was. But one day the villagers with new kind of people running it, they decided that actually they deserved to be punished for that, and so Chen was the one who got punished. He was held up in a cage, suspended from a cage, and this was in the middle of the dry season, obviously in the desert areas, so it was a pretty bad situation. But basically they sort of just left him there, that he died in this. And the whole idea of him learning to throw was that Lek saw that the cage was kind of weak, and if he could hit it hard enough, he might be able to open it and free his friend, his brother here. And he just threw rocks over and over and over again until he basically lost consciousness, effectively. And this is when Jason and Hark found him and brought him in as part of the group. But obviously, by the time he woke up on their bison, he knew that his brother was dead at this point in time. So this helps to explain why Lek is almost like the most representative of the group in terms of being an obvious Dao Fei. Why he doesn't like the lawmen, people who abide by the law, because effectively the law is what got his brother killed, and that's why he hates it so much. And it's a good explanation for how he learned to throw so much. There's an emotional reasoning behind it, and so on. And it's a nice moment as well, because he basically just says that you know, he at the end of this little conversation that they have, he does call Kyoshi sister for the first time, so he properly accepts her as being, part of the Dao Fei here, and it's a really nice moment between the two of them that I think works really really well. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think it really is a nice moment just because of, finally getting Lex sort of backstory here with his, his friend, his, person that he called his brother, and just sort of, all the hardship that he had to go through, just losing him, and how, no, he was sort of put into the cage, because of the law of the town. But, the town itself, doesn't even exist anymore where it is. So, he has that whole sort of idea and the whole association of law, just sort of not really meaning anything in sort of the long run of things. So it's definitely a pretty sort of touching story here, just to sort of get that. And I think with what they do with his character later on, it makes it, all the bit more sad, just with everything sort of considers here. But, it's nice to see that they finally sort of, connected together at this sort of, meaning here, and that, sort of she understands him a bit more, and sort of, no, she's sort of happy that, even if her parents didn't sort of, keep her, at least they were able to sort of, take him in from such a bad situation that he was in.
Yeah, and the this little back and forth I think does work really well because it is them properly connecting. Like they've had a couple of moments of like her stepping up for him at the when they met Wei again, and Mock, him protecting her a few times by being the sort of sniper from distance with the Shirshu a bunch of chapters ago, and then with the guy who nearly attacked Kyoshi at the raid. It's a nice sort of longer term kind of development thing over the course of the book that they have been at odds since they first met, and now they're close now, and the significance of him calling her sister I think is it's a nice moment as she realizes just how impactful that is. He does also suggest that potentially the reason why Jason and Hark left Kyoshi behind is that they felt she would live a better life with people who abided by the law, whereas Lek was only ever like useful for his skills, and they helped to raise him, but that I suppose she was priceless, so they wanted to protect her in some way, but he wasn't as much. And it's an interesting one because ultimately we don't really get an answer for why her parents did kind of just leave her basically like that. So Lek's answer there is kind of meant to be sort of the best that you can assume, because I suppose Kyoshi's meant to have this sort of softening of her view on her parents, having met the Dao Fei, kind of realizing that the group that her parents were with were nowhere near the same as like the Yellow Necks or anything like that. They were just smugglers. By all accounts, they don't really like kill anyone or even hurt people all that much. So they're pretty honorable people. And I think she's kind of realizing about her parents as well. But what's your take on that? Like that, this is one of the few times it is brought up, like someone suggesting why Kyoshi was left behind.
Yeah, no, that definitely is an interesting interpretation of it. I mean, it definitely seems like out of all of like I guess sort of like the bad sort of Dalfei, they were sort of like the nicest of them, which I guess is interesting considering they had an airbender as part of their group. So definitely, I don't know. I guess it puts it into perspective. Sort of what they did versus like the Yellow Necks, which are like the worst type of Dalfei ever. So yeah, no, I think I don't know. I wonder if we would ever sort of get like a clear cut sort of reason to why she sort of was left behind. I think, the idea that they bring up here as far as her, possibly getting a better life sort of with the law rather than with her parents, and sort of this, just sort of being these sort of smuggler type of people, might have possibly been better. But I think it's, the way that Kyoshi eventually did grow up. I mean, I guess, all things considered, it kind of worked out for her, but, she still has, this resentment for being sort of left alone to her own devices for, essentially half of her life up until this point. So it's definitely,
Mm.
it's definitely something that, I don't know if it'll ever be sort of explored more later on. I don't know if, maybe one of the people in the Flying Opera Company know more about sort of the reason why she was sort of left behind, but it seems like a lot of them, didn't even know that she was a thing, that she was just sort of, that Jason Hawk just sort of left for a while and then they sort of came back. So it may be one of those things that we never really sort of get a clear-cut answer for.
Hmm. Next chapter is chapter 29, The Ambush. And this is another John Zoo chapter. And yeah, there's a few interesting things here as basically he's pretty much back home at this point in time. He has to explain like what happened in like the previous chapters and stuff like that. And he's still hiding some stuff but telling certain people other stuff. It is mentioned here that he didn't really want to leave Zhu Ping on alive because obviously he was the one who defeated him in the first place, but that as a favor to the Fire Nation, he did leave Zhu alive so he could be studied by firebenders because they wanted to know the secret of his lightning technique. So that's a pretty interesting little fact about that. Gets across how rare the technique was. He does get a letter from Governor Tay, and it is revealed that Tay was one of the people who were within like Janzu's network. So the letter, effectively, it's just like Tay in a panic, kind of asking Janzu for like advice. He Part of the letter does include him asking like what are the correct methods to be a better governor, but along the way he also informs him that like, oh yeah, the prison that you asked us to look after, it was broken into, that guy was taken, I was nearly assassinated. So like I think you could almost come out of this kind of feeling like Tay immediately betrayed what Kyoshi said, but from his perspective, I suppose he's just reporting back to the person he's always reported back to about something important that happened, and it just happened that he met the Avatar, and he didn't know about the rivalry between Janzu and Kyoshi. So it's just this kind of inadvertent thing of like Kyoshi's let this guy live, and the information that he supplies to Janzu is going to lead to what happens, and so there is sort of a consequence of her letting him live already, not necessarily with the town that he governs over, but just with regards to his actions. So that's an interesting one to know about. Then suddenly, Hui suddenly shows up as well. He has a quick conversation with Heiran about things. They think they have more time, but Hui suddenly shows up at his door with tons of like sages and important people who are all people who are not part of his network and actively oppose Janzu. So he has to act really, really quickly here. So we then get this kind of setup that the tea is being served. He gets into a big argument with Hui, but then suddenly Janzu begins to like stumble around the place and then kind of collapses to the ground. Then suddenly everyone is like collapsing, getting sick around, and the idea is that the whole party has just been poisoned, and we're left kind of confused about what exactly has just happened in this chapter. It obviously gets fully explained in a little bit, but basically a lot of people have just died here. Only a few people have actually survived this poisoning incident here. But what are your thoughts on chapter 29?
Yeah, no, I think I don't know, another Jiangsu focus episode, getting his sort of thoughts on sort of what sort of happened and sort of, how he can, sort of, I guess, he's always trying to sort of, recover from this. Him and sort of Heiran just sort of discussing sort of what sort of happened, what sort of steps can be taken, how she really just sort of wants her daughter back. I think there's a lot of different things that go in here, and when they are sort of, I guess, as they say, ambushed by Hui and sort of him sort of, taking action that we quite haven't figured out yet. But, we know that he's involved in it somehow because they sort of mentioned him sort of being in the kitchen. I think it's definitely sort of interesting to see, you can really see how far he's willing to go at this point. Like there's almost like no stopping him from getting what he thinks is the right thing.
There's a lot of these references as well in this. The specific important people that he brings are actually pretty important. Like some of the references that they have here. Let me find it. Yeah, here we go. Herbalist Pan from Taku, General Sayuk, the Lord Commander of the Do Huan Fortress, um, Sage Ryong of Po Huai. A lot of places that we've kind of heard about before, especially herbalist Pan carrying his pet cat in his arms, and it's obviously meant to be a reference to the herbalist who has a cat, Miyuki, of course, and this is obviously meant to be, the previous herbalist almost type thing, a few herbalists before her. So some nice references and all of that, and then like you say, there's that nice emotional moment from Heiran of just her wanting her daughter back, that this has all gone a little bit too far, and obviously by the end of this we'll see in a second just who has survived this mass poisoning. But next up, chapter 30, Farewells. At the start of this we get Laoji and Kyoshi talking about how ultimately Kyoshi just feels that she feels inconsistent, that she did kill Zu but she didn't kill Tay, and is that right or wrong? Should she feels like she should have killed both or neither of them, and what does it even mean that she's thinking about it that way? And Laoji just kind of warns her that, like, as she gets more and more into being the Avatar, the decisions are just going to get worse and worse. They're going to get bigger and bigger, and she's always going to have to make these choices. That's just the sort of curse in a way of kind of being the Avatar, the curse of being neutral. There's a little bit of kind of great divide, like what the Canyon Guide says to Aang in this, but that's just what they're talking about there. He also notes right at the end here that she and Jianzhu have both defeated the same person, Zu, powerful bender. So does that mean she's finally ready to sort of get back on track? It's noted here that her hands, even though after all the healing and stuff like that, they're working again, the idea is that they're still like damaged, that they're kind of permanently scarred effectively. So Lek decides that he has a solution to this. He's going to bring Kyoshi out to get some gloves. And as they walk through the town, it's revealed that most people are actually afraid of Kyoshi because of the stories that were told about the way Zu was killed. Because what happened is that basically the Yellownecks fled through the city, explaining that like a kind of spirit person just like sucked the life force out of their leader, rather than like the Avatar killed a bandit leader. So the story is kind of getting a bit corrupted because she wasn't the one to tell it. So it hasn't gone completely in her way that she's finally made this big decision as the Avatar, and now she's kind of being vilified for it. It's not like she's not able to walk through the city, but it hasn't gone completely correctly. So they go to the tanner's place, and she tries on some gloves. None of them fit her because her hands are so big. So the guy brings out one of the special orders he had made, which are actually these gloves for a colonel from an army who died before he could pick them up. Kyoshi puts them on and they fit, and they're actually just full on like military gauntlets. The idea is that they're completely armored and huge, and she likes them. So the guy gives them to her because he's one of the few people in the village who recognizes that she took down Zu, a bandit leader, as the Avatar, and so this is her reward for that. Then in a very, very shocking moment at the end of this chapter, as Rangi, Kyoshi, and Lek are walking, back to the rest of the group, they're all hit with Shirshu darts from behind. Rangi is taken in all of this. Kyoshi's just left in the streets, as is Lek. But Lek actually just dies here. They just describe that he has a reaction to the poison. His like throat closes over, and by the time Kyoshi is able to get back up, which is like half an hour later, they just described that it was just this. There was no heartbeat. This lifeless body that was all that was left. So Lek is killed in a super surprising, shocking moment here at the end. As she returns back with Lek's body to the group, everyone is shocked that this has happened, and this is where it's fully revealed. Rangi has been taken, a note has been left, along with a cut-off top knot, which is Rangi's top knot, and the idea is that she's going to have to meet Jianzhu in Chinchao village. It's basically Chin village, but I'm not sure about the pronunciation of that alone. So she's going to have to go to Chin village to meet with Jianzhu to find Rangi and finish this, basically. Really, really shocking chapter. The death of Lek, I think, is probably one of the most surprising moments in the entire book because of what just happened like 2 chapters ago. Finally, Kyoshi and him are on good terms. They've told his backstory, and it seems like things are going great, and suddenly he's just gone. It really like floored me when I read this the first time, but what are your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, considering everything that we just learned about his character, is something that, you definitely wouldn't have wanted to happen, especially since he seems like a pretty, interesting character, and he is, pretty young too. So whenever that sort of happens, it's definitely, not the best of things. And just to see how, eventually it affects the whole group, I think is, it's a really, really sad moment, all things sort of considered. But yeah, no, I think it's, she gets sort of this sort of, positive thing to sort of cover her hands, despite what sort of happened before, which seems pretty, she's almost somewhat sort of happy about it because it seems to really sort of fit her sort of character, her sort of persona here. But it just, unfortunately, just now she's sort of seeing the results of everything that she's sort of let go before. So, it's interesting how they just sort of start the chapter off with sort of her, like, sort of indecision that she's sort of feeling about everything that she's done. And then, pretty quickly we see sort of the reactions of what she's done before.
Yeah, and I think it's this chapter, and maybe it's a little bit into the next one, but there's also this kind of attitude from Kyoshi, like, given what's just happened, that she took her eye off Janzu for like a second. Like there was just one moment where Laoji says "your man," and she doesn't immediately connect that it's kill Janzu. That she's let being the Avatar, being friendly with the group, kind of get in the way of that, and something terrible has happened, and she just kind of blames herself more for this. But it's just an interesting kind of her reaction to this. But we move into chapter 31, The Return, which is more or less our big sort of finale chapter. There still is 32, but 32 is kind of more of an epilogue type chapter. But yeah, so this is where it's explained what happened with the poisoning. So this was Janzu purposefully poisoning everyone with the tea. He had to poison himself and also Heiran to get the full ruse across. It's basically revealed Heiran is in a coma, that she's not waking up from what happened, and that she only barely survived. Janzu is still shaking off the effects of the poison. It's revealed that he used a mock's poison resistance training that he got from before. This is obviously way earlier on in the book. That's how he survived, and that Heiran survived because of her inner fire protecting her from the poison. Everyone else is dead. So all those important people from, I think they described it as like the north, like west or something like that of the Earth Kingdom, all of them are dead. So as well as a lot of the staff at his mansion back in Yokoya. So uh, he's done something really, really terrible here, in that he's put Heiran into a coma, and that's the one thing he sort of regrets coming out of this. And he basically just blames Hui for the results of everything that's happened here. We then cut back to see the funeral for Lek, and they just described that, with Siwang customs as well as Daofei customs, the idea is that they just sort of bury him like away from any place of like authority in a very simple grave. That's the way that he would have wanted it. As Kyoshi leaves to confront Janzu with the idea that the others are going to go somewhere else, it's pretty much later revealed that they're going to free Rangi, because the idea is that Kyoshi has an advantage here because Jansu isn't aware that she actually has a full team with her, and he's miscalculated that he thinks she's on her own completely, but she does actually have a team. So they go after Rangi as she confronts him one-on-one. So they're in Chin village here. They talk a little bit here, some background here about the clan of Chin and how they're very insular, and that they feel that they are better than the rest of the Earth Kingdom. They put themselves forward first as being from Chin village rather than being from the Earth Kingdom. So this is just some subtle setup, I think, for Chin the Conqueror eventually coming out of all of this. So the meeting is going to take place in this tea house in the center of this village, and he walks in. They're sitting either side of one of the tables there in the tea house, both suffering from lingering effects of like different poisons, basically. Jansu reveals that it was actually Rangi who the Shirshu were tracking the entire time. And yeah, this is the deal that's basically at play here. Jansu says, "Come with me, come back with me, be the Avatar, be the Avatar he wants her to be, basically, with him. and everything will be fine. If you don't, I'll collapse the tea house and kill everyone here. That's the threat. So he then explains after Kyoshi, insults him for what he's about to do. He explains what the full story is behind the Gravedigger of Zulu Pass. That basically he set an example of a few of the men at that point in time, and then basically said that whoever buries deepest into the mountain will be set free. The people behind them won't be. So he had them dig their own graves, and so everyone was in there. He just put the earth over the top, and that was it. That's how that's how he got that title. It's more brutal than you kind of expect, of just him cruelly having them dig their own graves. It seems even worse than just the idea from before that he just buried a mountain on top of them in the middle of a fight. This is way worse. And effectively, the entire action scene between Kyoshi and Jianzhu is literally just Jianzhu trying to bend the tea house down from one side of the table, Kyoshi blocking that bending, countering that bending from the other side of the table, and they both just have their hands, pointed all around them at the tea house, straining, fighting each other's bending, and all of a sudden, someone appears, walks right up to them. It's Yun, and there's a shocked reaction from, of course, Kyoshi and Jianzhu to seeing him alive, and all he does is he picks up the one of Lek's bullets. This was the idea of Kyoshi, if she was going to kill Jianzhu, was going to do it with one of Lek's bullets. Yun picks up that bullet, holds it in front of Jianzhu's chest, puts his other hand behind Jianzhu's chest, and basically just has the pebble switch hand through his body, so he just executes him there. Yun does it. And so Jianzhu is dead, killed by Yun. Yun doesn't say a word in all of this. He just goes to leave, and the house, the tea house is obviously still about to fall down because of the collapsing of everything that's going on. And surprisingly, Yun kind of bumps the wall. I think it bumps the table, which causes the entire place to begin to collapse. So Yun leaves as Kyoshi has to go into the avatar state to keep it from killing everyone, and she keeps it up just long enough for everyone to escape. And in the middle of all of this, we do have a kind of cutaway to a previous scene of Laoji explaining the longevity exercises to her, and the way that you actually go about increasing your lifespan effectively. So, and then everything comes to an end when, of course, Jianzhu's dead. Yun has gone missing once again. The group meets back up. Rangi is safe. Heiran, they have her back, but she's still obviously in a coma, and that's the end of this chapter, and then we'll get the epilogue in the next chapter. So really, really crazy stuff happens here. But what were your thoughts, I suppose, first on just, I suppose, how they did Kyoshi versus Jianzhu? That it wasn't some crazy bending fight. It was literally just them countering their earthbending while sitting across from each other in a tea house. What were your thoughts on how this big confrontation finally went?
Yeah, no, I thought that was definitely really interesting how they did that. I think it works really well because of how they basically just describe their bending sort of intermingling with each other, and just sort of the forces that they have to do. I think it's probably the best description that we've ever had of how, earthbending would actually sort of feel to, actually have that ability, and how to actually use it. Just sort of how at one point, they couldn't really tell, the difference between who was doing what, as far as who was keeping the tea house up and who was keeping it down, or who was trying to do whatever. It's really just sort of a state that they were sort of in. And, just the fact that they're in the tea house doing this, just sort of in pose, but everyone around them just sort of ignoring them. They sort of mentioned early on how it seemed like it was just sort of a father-daughter sort of fight that they were sort of having, that it wasn't anything sort of serious that any of the rest of the people in this sort of village hasn't seen before. So they sort of basically ignore everything that's sort of going on. I mean, she drew some attention when she came into the village initially, just with her, her get-ups, and she's in the full sort of armor that we know her to have now. But besides that sort of like initial sort of moment here, there's nothing really to sort of stand out because they're not sort of, doing any sort of crazy move or anything like that. I mean, they're still both, very sort of powerful. But the fact that both of them are sort of, injured from, various sort of poisons that they have, even if they were to sort of go all out, it probably still wouldn't be, what we're normally, used to seeing either one of them being able to do. So it's interesting how they sort of integrated that into this whole idea here. And just the fact that while they're doing this whole sort of like keeping the tea house up and down, Kyoshi earlier has sort of tried to shoot the bullet at Jianzhu, using sort of the fan to control something, a lot smaller than she's used to actually doing. So there's also this sort of bullet, from Lek that he didn't get to use that Kyoshi's trying to sort of force through Jianzhu that eventually we see Yoon is able to sort of come out of nowhere and actually sort of force through Jianzhu, which is just a whole interesting thing in itself, how they describe, that sort of rock element that is, being controlled by both of their abilities, sort of being plucked out of it. So the way that they describe sort of that lost sort of sensation of feeling that they have from that sort of element not being connected to either one of them at one point, I think is definitely really cool to see how, how it would feel in a sense to actually have, something that you're sort of trying to control through this ability sort of just disappear, in a sense. So no, I think it's definitely really cool how they describe that whole sort of battle scene. It's not like a crazy landslide or anything like that, which, both of them could do quite easily. It's more sort of restrained here, until you see sort of, the end result of it and Kyoshi having to actually hold the whole sort of place up with, sort of the avatar state and getting everyone out there. So then you can sort of, I think it gives you an idea of the scope of, sort of what they're doing, which doesn't seem like it would be such a huge thing, but it's really sort of like a huge feat to hold in itself.
Yeah, the struggle I think is written really well because they even at one point I think described that like Kyoshi tears a muscle in her like rib cage because of the sheer like strain that when two earthbenders are both trying to like bend the same piece of earth, there is a physical thing. It's not just them this like outside power that they kind of fight with. It does have a effect on them physically because I suppose when you think about it, like how bending works, it is their chi inside their body being able to be projected outside it. So if that connection of that chi to their element is being kind of forced back or something like that, of course it would have like a backlash on the body because it is still connected to the body. So I think this is definitely one of the best examples of a description of like that idea that we've got before, of just two benders battling and the idea of like who is the more powerful here, and it works because they've both been through so much on this journey up to this point. Janzu with having to keep his story straight and hunt after Kyoshi, and she notes that when she sees him he's like aged so much, whereas Kyoshi has just kind of grown more and more as a person, and she's almost like stronger now, but because they're both suffering from poison, they're still roughly even. And when you really break it down, it really comes down to the fact that Janzu didn't expect Kyoshi to be skilled when he encountered her, and so her simply being able to bend at all is a surprise to him, and that she doesn't even reveal to him that it's because of the fans, but the fact that she's able to counter him is a surprise, and so that's why this happens the way it happens, and that she's not she doesn't have enough experience to overwhelm him, but he doesn't have the power to get through her, and so it's just this stalemate. It's like he's stuck in this position of still trying to force Kyoshi to be the avatar under his guidance, not knowing that that's never going to happen, and he's willing to kill innocent bystanders to make that happen. It shows how far he's fallen in a way that he's still thinking he can scavenge something from this, but he can't. And yeah, it all leads up to the sudden arrival of Yoon back into the story, and I think it's worth talking about this in a decent amount of detail because it is probably the talking point coming out of this book. Is like, wait, as far as we were aware, he was dead. That spirit wanted to kill him. The whole idea of like the price in blood. Father Glowworm took him. He's gone. Like obviously we didn't see a body because like Jonzu like sealed up the mountain. But what happened here? Because the way he's described, it says here, his skin had the glow of a healthy adventurer back from a successful trip. Neat stubble lining his jaw. His eyes twinkled with the same warm mischief that Kyoshi remembered so well. None of this kept a blinding, nauseating sense of wrongness from pouring out of his body. People had always been drawn to Yun like metal to a lodestone, and Kyoshi had been no exception, but he changed. There was something essential missing from the otherworldly being in front of her, something human. And it's also said here that people sort of like looked at him like he was like a rotting corpse. They didn't want to be around him. So what's happened to Yoon, and especially when, like you said there, the fact that he's able to just go up and basically just pluck that bullet, Lex bullet, out of the combined grip of both Kyoshi and Jonzu, who are super powerful benders. And yes, Yoon was a powerful earthbender, and we got described that he had like a special ability with like floating earth and stuff like that, but he never seemed like he had this power level of just being able to just effortlessly take that out and then so easily just execute Jonzu like that. Something's happened to him. What is it? What were your thoughts on just seeing Yoon suddenly appear after like no setup? He just arrives here and is so different than what we knew before.
Yeah, no, that definitely was very unexpected just to see him sort of come back and sort of have such a description about him that, is like a complete sort of contrast to what he used to be, which I think is obviously done for effect, but I think it gets across the point that, whatever has happened to him before, which maybe will be something that's discussed in the next book, or at least I hope it is something pretty sort of drastic. I mean, I don't know, I think it'll be interesting just to get more, hopefully, on Father Glowworm and by, of course, him as well, because it definitely seems like there's some, I don't know, just the way that they describe Father Glowworm as just sort of a spirit in general definitely seems like that has had some effect on Yoon being here now and with the abilities or how he's actually, seems to appear at this point. I mean, clearly something's happened with him in the spirit world. So I don't know. I think that's definitely an interesting part that keeps you sort of, wondering and intrigued for the next book. So I think it's definitely a cool part. It just, it definitely there's not much, at least that I can see right now, to go on sort of why he is the way he is.
Mm. And then the big thing that shows you that something is very wrong is the fact that he's the one to basically, in bumping the place, cause it to collapse. So he doesn't care about the people, other people in there. Or even Kyoshi, the fact that on his way out he's just willing to let her basically deal with whatever the results are. So definitely it's very interesting. But I think it's worth talking as well about the sort of cutaway scene here describing the longevity exercises basically. It's a weird place to do it in that I suppose they're ultimately getting across that a kind of side effect of, in a way, what she learns here is also sort of how she learned to gain some control over the avatar state, because she is basically able to activate it at will here to save everyone here. But it says here, Lao Ji had insisted, despite her protest that she didn't need to unlock the secrets of immortality, he'd made her join him in his daily longevity exercises. He'd taken her to the same spots that a guru would meditate in: the curves of flowing rivers, the stumps of once massive trees, caves bored into the cliffside, but he'd also filled her ear with counterintuitive nonsense. Instead of blocking everything out like how you would normally meditate, take it all in. Notice each blade of grass in the same moment. You would notice a single one. And he also says, divide your body in two, then divide it again, then again and again. What would you have left? A bloody mess. Exactly. Put the pieces back and put them back again and again and again, one more time, and you're whole once more. A human being isn't a block of stone, is Kyoshi's response. But he says, that's where you're wrong. The illusion that self is separate from the rest of the world is the driving factor that limits our potential. Once you realize there's nothing special about the self, it becomes easier to manipulate. And this idea that you're not anyone special, is sort of kind of what allows her to go into the avatar state. But it's an interesting one in that they give you the answers without ever giving you the like answer you really want about how it all works. In that, um, for benders, I think the whole longevity thing makes a little bit more sense because they can directly control their chi, and the way they describe it of like moving parts around in a way in your body on like a tiny little level, you can sort of understand how that works with regards to a bender controlling their own chi, and like the idea of it's like this almost subtle energy bending type thing to just keep your body going, counteracting the the effects of aging and so on. But ultimately, it's still vague in all of this, but it's all there. What's your take on this, given that this is one of the last mentions of this in the book?
I don't know. I mean, I think for what they're sort of going for, or at least how he's sort of describing sort of the breakdown part of the body and then being able to sort of sense it in a way that you can sort of put it back, continue with what he mentioned sort of before. I think, it's sort of, for the way that his idea of the world and sort of his idea of how, everyone is special and not special and can have sort of an effect on the world. It sort of goes with the way that he sort of views things. And it seems, as far as we can tell, it seems to has been working for him to keep him alive for many years at this point, maybe even more than we really think of, if the math works out the way it should work out. But yeah, no, so I don't know. I think it's interesting that he sort of puts this on Kyoshi. He sort of, has her do this despite her not really wanting to sort of know this sort of technique or anything like this, but clearly she uses it to good effect over the period of her life.
Mm. Yeah, because she seems to use it primarily because it sort of helps her spiritually, in that, as we'll get in the next chapter, it seems to be what sort of connects her to the Avatar spirit. It seems to have helped her with the Avatar state. But I suppose the question with Kyoshi going forward is going to be, she's going to have to actively make the decision to want to use this to extend her life, to want to live longer than 100 or so years. And why does she want to do that and not just live a standard life, I suppose, in a way? That's going to be the big question going forward. I suppose it's the question with all of these characters of, like, if you have an ability that, like, you have to choose to do it, like, and you constantly have to do it, what keeps you doing it to keep yourself going and all of this? And that if Laoji is in fact like 4,000 years old, as the numbers would seem to suggest, why does he continue to keep himself alive that long? And what's going to keep Kyoshi keeping herself alive like up to 230 years old? But we'll have to wait and see what the actual answers are. But we'll move into the final chapter of the book, which is chapter 32, Hauntings. And we cut to Kyoshi at the Southern Air Temple, sort of reflecting on things. We find out, epilogue style, kind of what happened to everyone. Kirima and Wong are taking a break from smuggling. They're using some of the stuff that they stole from Jianzhu's mansion while they were rescuing Rangi to kind of fund that sort of break. Laoji, it's just explained that he's resting his old bones, but that he did say that Kyoshi, now as the Avatar, is one of the people on his watch list. So there could be a potential assassination attempt coming from him, but she does note that she kind of trusts herself to be able to defeat him if it ever came down to it. Heiran is now awake, but in really bad need of healing. So Rangi is going to be bringing her to the Northern Water Tribe to get the best healing possible for her. That means that Rangi and Kyoshi are going to be apart for a pretty long time. So they have to say goodbye to each other, with the idea that potentially when they meet again, they might be very different people. And then it's explained, okay, that she basically revealed herself as the Avatar by just going on a hike with a bunch of other people up to the Southern Air Temple, and then revealing that she can bend two elements. And she basically has since then let the air nomads deal with the sort of results of that now that she's open out there as the Avatar. And I like this description that she's at peace here at the Air Temple, and that the air nomads are not doing any of the politicking that you would associate with Jianzhu and Hui over the course of this book. They're just there to try and help her and make it as easy as possible for her. and they're the ones doing all of the dealings with the Earth sages and stuff like that, asking why is she not being trained in the Earth Kingdom and stuff like that. This monk named Jinpa is the one kind of dealing with her, and we just get a recap on like, okay, she's told that like loads of people back in Yokoya, especially with the mansion, are dead, and she's gonna have to go back at some point to find out exactly who is alive, who is dead. It's also revealed here Janzu's will actually revealed that he's leaving everything to the Avatar, and it does specifically note that he did list Kyoshi's name specifically as being the Avatar. So he wrote a very recent will, potentially just prior to having that confrontation with her, where he's leaving everything in his possession to the Avatar. So Kyoshi now owns the mansion and all that sort of stuff. So that's pretty interesting. And she does ask, with regards to her effect on the Airbenders, that Kelsang's name be restored to an esteemed status within the temple, and potentially a statue would be nice, but I think that's more of a joke. And then she's on her own meditating, and basically she basically communicates with Karuk at this point. A vision of him appears before her, and he asks for her help. So that's the big kind of ending of the book, that Karuk has finally spoken to Kyoshi, and now it's here to ask for her help with something. What could it be? What's this about? And that's the big cliffhanger ending of the book. But what are your thoughts on this final chapter here?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good one to sort of get a recap of everything that sort of happened. Kyoshi sort of finally revealing herself to the world, how she, goes about sort of this pilgrimage to the Southern Air Temple, which apparently a lot of people do, but she, goes up there sort of like unannounced, just sort of with them, and sort of reveals this, noting that, she still needs bending practice with, sort of the elements, especially not using them with the fan. But I don't know, I think it's cool to see that, she has this spot here that they gave her, essentially sort of like where the Avatar would stay if they were at this temple here. So she sort of has her own sort of space here to sort of meditate and reflect on things, which is what she's sort of doing this whole time here. So I think it's definitely cool to see her sort of taking, I guess sort of essentially a break of things here, and sort of letting other people deal with sort of the fallout of everything that has sort of happened. So I think it's, it's cool that she, she had this place in mind to sort of, I guess, buffer herself from the rest of the world and everything that normally sort of happens here, and how, if there was any sort of, I guess, nation to go to, it would be the Air Nation, the Air Nomads, that would sort of, be able to sort of, I guess, just take everything in stride and not sort of, be so forceful with her. Not that it seems like she would really be moved that way, but, she doesn't have to put as much sort of effort to sort of, be on her own at this point. So, no, I think this is definitely, it's a nice way to sort of end, I guess, sort of the book with her just sort of, coming to realize sort of like the things that she's going to have to do in the future, and to sort of end it with this sort of like a meditation of, just sort of seeing Karuk and sort of him, coming to her in this form and asking for, some help with something that, we don't quite know, but it's going to be, potentially important for the next chapter or next book.
And then there's one little bit from the second last page of the book that I do want to talk about here. I'll just read out this bit and then we can discuss it. As you wish, Avatar Kyoshi, and if you have further requests, let me know. It's the least my compatriots and I can do after failing to come to your assistance for so long. We were unfortunately in the dark along with the rest of the world. Kyoshi tilted her head. The air nomads weren't to blame for my troubles. Referring to a different we? I'm referring to a different we. Jinpa scratched the back of his neck. Do you play Pai Sho by any chance? Kyoshi frowned at his cryptic statement and sudden tangent. I do not. I have no taste for the game. This one, like the first few times I read this, I was like, wait, what on earth is this about? Like, it just trails off, and I'm like, is this meant to be Order of the White Lotus? Like the first hint at it? I don't know. What was your opinion on that one? The whole we referring to a different we, and then Pai Sho being brought up immediately.
Yeah, no, I guess, that seems like the default connection that you would make just from, the whole Pai Sho reference. I mean, I don't know, it could have been just sort of some other sort of former group of just sort of airbenders in general that sort of had their eyes more towards sort of like worldly things, just because they sort of mention him sort of being, sort of the one that deals with anything that this air temple has to do with sort of the outside world. So maybe that's because he is part of the White Lotus, or maybe just because of him just sort of having more of an air to the world as far as like worldly things that have to be dealt with. So I don't know. I think the Pai Sho one is an interesting one, and clearly she's either, I mean, she hasn't really been involved in that many sort of worldly things, so it's not something that you would think that she would be able to sort of get as far as being knowing anything sort of about the Order of the White Lotus, if that is even sort of a thing at this time, which I wouldn't be surprised if it is, considering it seems like it has a pretty long sort of history, and this it isn't really that far away from the time that we sort of know of. So, but no, I think that is definitely a nice sort of a nod to something else that hopefully we get found out later on.
Hmm. So yeah, that's our, I suppose, the main discussion here on the rise of Kyoshi done. So let's just get into some, I suppose, some final thoughts here. I definitely, the more and more I read the book, read through it, do different chapters, analyze them on like YouTube and stuff like that. I do think this is pretty much for me like the best Avatar material, like that is not the shows. I think this immediately is like, obviously Avatar, Korra, and then like Rise of Kyoshi. I think is just, it's that good that it does really just effortlessly slot in as the other main piece of content. Like I think like comics like The Search are very, very good, and they're kind of close to it. But I think this as just the first novel really does stand out, and I think it is very well written on all accounts, and it's not just because it's the first ever, Avatar novel. I do just honestly think it is a well written book from all accounts, in terms of it gets the world building right, characters, plot, the little details, how interconnected the story is in terms of setting up stuff earlier on that's referenced later on, or foreshadows stuff and then comes back to it. Um, I think this book is just really, really good on all accounts, and it's not just a good Avatar book. I think it is just a good book, full stop. And the fact that it tells a fairly contained story. I like that it doesn't really feel too part one-y in that way. Like you've got told a decent story here, in that if even if we didn't know there was a second book, you kind of feel like, okay, apart from a few little open threads, like I'd be okay leaving it off here. But the fact that there is another book coming, it feels like okay, and we can start again. We can pick up those threads, but it doesn't feel like we've stopped right in the middle of a story. So I really can't praise this book enough for just how good it is. That's kind of where I'm at now with this book. I think it's kind of the go-to story stuff after you watch the two shows, if you're just getting into Avatar, in my opinion. And I hope they do more books, because this is what we need, I think, going forward. And I think the biggest thing to praise for me probably is just the detail throughout, just those little mentions of, when Zoo lightning bends, and then they have little talks about, like Rangi mentioning that, this is like a secret technique. It's only been like rumored about. No one really knows about it, and that sort of stuff. Those details, we need more stuff with that. But what are your sort of final thoughts on the Rise of Kyoshi?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is a very good book. I think it definitely it gets the idea of the world of Avatar, I think, really well. It gets a lot of the details that you sort of remember from the show sort of in place here. I think overall the story is pretty good. I don't think I have any sort of like major sort of issues with it. I think, there are some points where it doesn't seem quite as, I don't know, as sort of like interesting, or as sort of, I guess, sort of story wise as it could be, I guess, sort of towards the end with what is going to come out for the next sort of book. But I think, I think like you said, it does sort of work more so as like sort of a standalone. It doesn't feel, I think the way that they end it doesn't put it off as much of a point to where there needs to be sort of a half book, next book. I think maybe that makes it so that the cliffhanger isn't sort of as sort of impactful as it really could be. I think it is. I don't know. I think it's cool that we do get Kuruk at the end, but it doesn't seem. I mean, they sort of set it up a bit that he wasn't sort of like the best sort of avatar. So I guess you could kind of see why he might be sort of asking for some sort of help, but we don't really know sort of like why he's really sort of asking for the help. So maybe it doesn't quite hit me as hard as an ending as it potentially could be in general. So maybe it's, it almost seems like it could just be like if they didn't have that part, it would just, work fine as is, other than, sort of the other parts I know of Kyoshi's life that are, really interesting that I do sort of want to know. So those parts are probably more so what I'm interested in for the next book rather than sort of finding out sort of what specifically, Kuruk is asking for, which I'm sure, at least I would think that it is going to integrate somehow, but that part, doesn't seem almost as interesting as maybe finding out more about sort of like Yoon and sort of what's going on with him, just because he was sort of like such an important character in the first sort of part of the book. But overall, I think it does really good. It's definitely something that I would recommend for fans to check out. I don't know, for me, I think the earlier comics that are more sort of in universe sort of work on the same sort of level for me as this sort of book. I think the book works better because it has so much more sort of detail into it, so you can really sort of get an idea of sort of the scope of things. So I think that's definitely where the book excels in that sort of aspect, because it doesn't have the visuals. It has to sort of describe everything in pretty much, in really good sort of detail, which I think for me was done really good. Like I can sort of picture it. I wonder sort of how that would work sort of as well if I didn't know the show as much, which is obviously pretty hard for me to do because I do know the show very well. So it's interesting to see. I don't know. I would be interested in seeing someone who isn't familiar with the show, what they sort of think about sort of the book on its own, which I don't know. That would be interesting to see. Just what someone would say about that, if that could even been done, because I mean, a lot of people who would get this book know about the show. But no, I think it's definitely a recommended book for any sort of Avatar fan to sort of get to. It's not a hard book. It's pretty straightforward. I think it has enough detail where it's not sort of boring, but it definitely is sort of a YA level book, so you can read it, pretty quickly in like a week or two, depending on how fast you read or how much time you have.
Yeah, like it is easy to read. Like the whole writing style thing was a big kind of debate. Like, what is it before the book even came out? But yeah, I think this is kind of exactly what we wanted in terms of having enough detail to add to the universe without being this sort of slog to get through a page because it's so descriptive. I think the only criticism I've seen of the book on like a technical level is that, and I did so ultimately kind of agree with this, because I did kind of think back like, actually they didn't really do that much, was just describing the characters all that much. In that I kind of think back on it and I'm like, yeah, like visually I don't remember all that much mentioned about visually what a lot of the characters look like. In that we of course know what Kyoshi looks like, but in terms of her, it's just like, okay, she's tall, she's got big hands, she's got big feet, and she has freckles on her face. Like that's all they really described about kind of what she looks like. Similarly with Rangi, it's like, okay, you get her eye color. She wears like a Fire Nation military uniform and stuff like that. But that was kind of about all you got. And then especially for like say someone like Kirima, where it's just like she's a waterbender who wears kind of waterbender / Earth Kingdom clothes, and it's like I don't have a great visual for what she looks like in my mind type thing. And that's where I almost wish that like the book did have like a few illustrations throughout somewhere, that it was maybe like a light novel and just had, here's a few pages at the very start in color that have some visuals of the characters, and then you can go through the book without needing to be super visually descriptive. But I think that's the only real thing that I kind of saw someone out there saying. I was like, actually, yeah, that probably is just about right. But how do you feel about that? Do you feel that maybe they could have, with the characters, described what they looked like a little bit more?
Yeah, no, that's definitely something that I would sort of agree with, just thinking back on sort of description of characters. I think they give you like sort of like initial sort of like base sort of description of the characters and sort of like their girth or their weight or just sort of their general size. I think they do that to sort of good effect a couple times, usually just when they sort of introduce a character, but it definitely seems like after that, other than, Kyoshi, just because of her character and her size in general, they make note of her, how much she sort of stands out in general, especially like when she wears different outfits and stuff. But other than her, the rest of your characters, you don't really get that much of an idea of what they sort of visually sort of look like. Like even Rangi, for all the time that we sort of spend with her, other than the fact that she has a top knot, there's nothing really in her sort of like outfit in general. There's nothing really to sort of distinguish her from sort of any other sort of character that you see throughout the story, and she's one that we were around the most. So that is, that definitely is something that I could see that could need to be worked on later on, or I guess if they did chose to do illustrations, which was something that we thought there was going to be more of in general. That seemed like a thing that was going to be there, which I know in like the special edition version there was like a map and some other stuff, but I don't know. I mean, a lot of books, they don't really have, a lot of illustrations in them, but I don't know, maybe just because this comes from a show, that would have been something that would have been really cool to have.
Mm. Yeah, with that description, I'm kind of like, was what they were referring to there the fact that like on any of the chapter title pages, there is a little bit of like visual stuff going on there with the sort of like brush marks over the top and bottom of the title, and the fact there's a bit of like kind of shadowing on the sides of the pages. Is that what they mean by like
Hmm.
black and white illustrations and not actual like pictures? I'm not really sure, but that's kind of what I kind of took from it. But yeah, like compared to the comics, like I think that the comparison I'd make is that I think it stacks up, like some of those comics still stack up very well against this, especially the early comics. I think the more recent ones not as much because they don't have the details. Whereas like the Promise had detail because it was the first one. The Search has so much going on, even beyond just the obvious, Ursa stuff. Like the Rift had the whole Yang Chen and Spirit stuff going on. Smoke and Shadow had Kimura Kage and lots of stuff. North and South and Imbalance so far, I think, are where like I think this book really kind of highlights how
Yeah.
lacking the recent comics have been in terms of just they've been so focused on just one thing and they haven't been doing like a side plot or a character arc in the background, that sort of stuff that we could have used. Like North and South probably should have gone into the history of the Northern and Southern Water Tribe to just give something a little bit more substantial to it. Um, Imbalance probably should have at some point, and maybe it will still in part three, go into the actual history of Bender non-Bender relations, because it feels like it's being talked about with ever it's being kind of mentioned as being a thing without ever any examples from history having come up about it, and that you can reflect on it. And like in ATLA, like there really wasn't any examples of like Bender non-Bender inequality outside of just here's a Bender like Zuko alone is probably the only real example of like a Bender doing something to like a non-Bender town type thing. Um, that's where I think it highlights just that this book seems like the best thing ever because we're in a kind of era at the moment a little bit where some of the comics aren't covering as much as they could. Ruins of the Empire, part one was just a start. Hopefully, part two and three can like get there and be as strong as they need to be. But I think that's roughly where I stand on like the comics versus the one novel that we have at the moment. It's just I want the comics to kind of go back to having a little bit more of that detail, and hopefully we can. But what's your take on that? How do you think this stacks up against like we've covered the comics so much, and here's our first novel?
Yeah, no, I think I pretty much agree with that. I think the early ones of the novels, I think, especially since they're so tied into things that we know from the show, that they work really well to that effect because they're essentially just extra detail on sort of stories and plot lines that sort of needed to be resolved from the original series versus the ones that are sort of later. They're sort of things that they're cool stories, but they're not something that really we know as much about, which I don't know, I guess, if those are done well, an original story can definitely do just as well as something that's connected to the show, but it doesn't seem like there's the same level of connectivity to, I guess, just sort of the series in general versus, something like the Kyoshi novel, which is, is one little bit of the Avatar world that we know of, but just, expanded upon by like, 100% or whatever. So that's definitely where the book definitely, I guess, rises above some of those other comics that, don't feel like they have as much going for them as of now, at least.
Yeah, like it's just in terms of, I suppose, what we learn about from this book. Like one of the main things I would say we learn about here is the politics around the training of the Avatar, just through Zhu and everything there. That's one of the best parts of this book, just knowing that like there's all this plotting and scheming going on, especially in an Earth cycle with all the sages and it not being a particularly spiritual thing, and it being more about the politics, and that's like the entire almost motivation of our villain in this book. That was really cool to see, especially in those earlier chapters of like um, getting stuff like here's the Earth way of actually locating the Avatar, but it hasn't worked, so we have to use the air way of finding the Avatar, and even that like being a reveal that the Avatar relics were actually the air nomad way and not just a method. And then it's all those little details along the way of just these subtle setups. It's references to stuff of like even the Shearshoe coming back, even though like we didn't discuss it all that much, really nicely used. Even though like they were used in like Korra for like the spit darts and stuff like that, we see them come back. It's just using everything the way it needs to be, and it's even stuff like the fact that Zhu is from the Ganjin tribe. I think it's only mentioned twice in the entire book that he's Ganjin, but it's a great reference to an episode that I think a lot of other creators, if they were writing this book, maybe would never have gone for. But I love that it makes sense that you have this character from one of those tribes that's not particularly well looked at, basically, by the Earth Kingdom. But here he is forcing his way into this, powerful position, and he's doing anything he can to keep it. And then right towards the end, they do introduce a kind of similar guy on the Zhang side of things. It's a very minor thing. He's one of the guys that he gets poisoned at the end. But it was just a fun reference that they brought back the Zhang Ganjin rivalry. All that stuff I think really stands out to me throughout this book. But I suppose one of the final points here, Greg, what were just some of the interesting sort of world building details that this book presented that you really liked?
Yeah, I think the whole training of the Avatar, I think, is really cool in itself. I think the whole idea of just the lawlessness of the world at this time, I think, was really cool for just showing how the structure of the Earth Kingdom was at this point, how it's really just sort of like all over the place. I think that, it helps to sort of get in perspective for the show itself how things were sort of all over the place. Even during, Korra's time, is still, just the fact that, the Metal Clan was able to sort of come up out of nowhere, it makes slightly more sense why something like that could exist in a place, that otherwise should be one place. I mean, yeah, it's a big sort of continent in itself, but just the fact that there's Omashu with King Bumi, and there's like why does that even exist? I think that as far as world building for me was one of the things that I really sort of liked. I mean, yeah, we didn't really get to travel the world yet. Hopefully they do that in sort of the second book, but I think for what the book's focus was, which was Kyoshi, of course, I think that sort of makes sense that they were able to sort of key into that sort of aspect of the world. But other than that, I think just seeing the characters, I think that was pretty interesting. Just the whole idea of the Dao Fei and just sort of that sort of code that they have, which I guess isn't sort of like a unique sort of crazy thing, just sort of like in societies in general, how there's sort of like this sort of like underbelly of the world that most people don't know about. But I think it's cool that you can see how the Avatar world had that sort of back in the day, and how that might sort of translate to sort of current day in the Avatar world. So I think those aspects for me was something that really sort of stood out overall.
Mm. Yeah, I definitely like that, because the whole Dao Fei thing, the way the Earth Kingdom is described politically throughout this whole book, um, really helps to add, I suppose, impact to like what Runes of the Empire is dealing with right now, with the importance of these democratic elections, and you know, actually, I suppose, truly allowing the different parts of this giant place to actually just govern themselves, um, and how much of a change this will be if it succeeds, I think is really great to see. I suppose the Daofei effectively kind of are that of like in an era where it is just the Earth King and like the King of Amashu who are like the main people in charge. You have these kind of groups just rise up in these places where the influence of those leaders aren't found, and you have these bandit groups form. Yes, the elections kind of are a way to sort of counter that and have more control in each different section. So I like that, and it sort of contrasts with what like the Avatar comics are doing right now, with obviously the focus on imbalance and the not bender non-bender stuff. It's basically a setup for book one of Korra, but it's not hitting home as hard because it's so obvious what the kind of point that they're making is, rather than really building onto anything. Like, it's great that like we're getting, you know, Cranefish Town is going to become Republic City, but um, it's one of those things where it just feels like it's inevitable what the Avatar comics are covering right now, whereas that little world building thing of, you know, showing the chaos here versus the progress actually being made, it's actually quite nice. But yeah, I suppose the very final thing is just some basic speculation on the next book, which is it The Shadow of Kyoshi, The Shadows of Kyoshi, or just Shadow of Kyoshi? I'm not sure about the specific, if there's a shadows or just one shadow for Kyoshi. But either way, that's the next book. Some speculation on it. So the obvious setup points for me are Yun is the obvious thing, just in terms of main character at the start of the book, killed surprisingly sort of very early on in the book, comes back and basically takes out Kyoshi's main enemy. That immediately jumps him to like right at the top. There's the immediate thing of Karuk asking for help and what that means, and there's other kind of little bits and pieces in terms of like, you know, how will she finish her training and so on. Will she continue waterbending training with Kirima, or and so, that sort of stuff. With Karuk, I have to assume that the idea that they're going for there is that this relates to how Karuk died, which this book touched on the fact that he died very young without going into detail on it, in that it seemed like no one wanted to talk about like the last years of Karuk's life and what was going on then. I think he's probably asking Kyoshi for help with that very thing. What it is, I'm not entirely sure, because we've always wanted to know what is the issue there. How did he die? We assume it was like just constantly going after Ko and eventually he died, but is it that? And why is he asking Kyoshi to do it? And in a way, like, what is the dynamic between Kyoshi and Karuk going to be? In that anytime Kyoshi mentioned Karuk, she seemed to not like his approach, but if he says the right things and presents his story well enough, you know, he could become much more sympathetic. So what are your thoughts on what Karuk is talking about here? What this help that he needs is?
Yeah, no, I wonder if it's help with him on sort of like a personal level, or if it's a help with him sort of on like an Avatar sort of world level, just because of him, you know, maybe he's finally realized his sort of negligence, that he's done, you know, the disservice to the world, and that's sort of what he deems is, you know, important enough to sort of bring up to Kyoshi, you know, from beyond the grave, from the spirit world. I don't know, I think that would be interesting just to see if he's grown as, I guess, sort of a character, I guess, in his sort of like death per se. I don't know. They make him seem very sort of, you know, the little bits that we do get of him, they make him seem very sort of like selfish and sort of like self-centered, or just sort of self-involved as far as like an Avatar goes. Like he just sort of went with the flow and things sort of worked out, but that's sort of what they told us during the show. But now we have a slightly better idea that, you know, things didn't necessarily work out. Like he just sort of like banked on the fact that the Avatar before him did all this sort of like good in the world, and that he was able to sort of just chill around while he was able to sort of like become sort of like a full-fledged avatar, and just sort of like a little bit after that, he sort of just, he had to die or whatever sort of happened to him. So I don't know. I think I definitely can see them sort of integrating that and making it sort of interesting in some sort of way. I mean, I think it definitely is a cool way to sort of end the book in general, even if there's not as much of it to really sort of go on as of now, at least.
Mm. The other thing for me is just probably the biggest mystery of all of this is why did Ko specifically go after Karuk and do what he did to Umi? Um, I suppose giving that explanation is probably the main thing, in that Ko is mentioned in this book by Father Glowworm as kind of being like, oh, he's that like wild spirit that started talking to humans, and now humans think they can talk to any spirit. So the idea of Ko is obviously that he's this sort of meddlesome spirit, and especially what they did in the search with introducing, the fact that his mother is the mother of faces, and a lot of what he's doing is just kind of like acting out as like a kind of child. It gets across the idea that he actually is maybe a younger spirit, even though like Roku still mentions him as still being an ancient spirit. Um, I want to know why Ko is sort of apparently put himself in that position where he will punish the Avatar if they do something wrong or type thing, or did Karuk encounter Ko before and something happened? That's what I want to know, because otherwise, like this book, I think did ultimately do a better job at explaining like why it was a negative thing what Karuk did, and that they set up the idea that there were all these kind of subtle Dao Fei things happening across the Earth Kingdom, diplomatic disputes that he wasn't really getting involved in, and then when he died, his team was the ones who had to deal with all of that, and that's where they got their sort of tarnished legacies from, of Kelsang having to defend that coastline and killing people, the Gravedigger stuff for John Zhu, and then Heiran with all the Agni Kai stuff. What are your thoughts on Ko in all of this? Do you think we will get some more details on that stuff from Ko?
I would expect it in some sort of way, just because not maybe not. I mean, I don't know, because he has some involvement with Karuk. You would think that it would be sort of like an obvious thing that we would get his sort of involvement, but it could also be through sort of Father Glowworm, just sort of. I don't know, with whatever is sort of happening with sort of Yoon, which I'm assuming is involved with Father Glowworm, just sort of that whole sort of aspect there. I mean, I think there's definitely going, or at least I would hope there would be some sort of like, spirit world or spirit sort of like part of the next book that would sort of bring these sort of ideas and concepts, just to the forefront in general. I mean, it's something that, we haven't seen from Kyoshi too much as far as like her spiritual sort of side of things, but it seems like, she's getting more of it, and she is at a airbending temple right now. So it definitely seems like something that could be more of a priority for her to sort of get in the more sort of like current time rather than sort of later on. So no, I think having Ko involved in the story in some way definitely seems like something that should sort of happen, just because they mention him as being sort of like an upstart sort of spirit sort of interacting with humans. So that whole idea I think is pretty, intriguing in general.
Mm-hmm. And then yeah, Yoon, it's a little bit more to speculate on, because we at least get the moment where he was lost, quote unquote, and the return, and we can sort of compare and contrast. And like again, you go back to the scene where he was taken away, and he specifically chose to let go of Kyoshi and sort of accept what was going to happen to him. They talked in that moment about kind of him losing sense of his identity the second it was revealed that he wasn't actually the Avatar. So even if he had survived that moment, you got the idea that his personality was probably going to change, that now he wasn't the important person anymore. And so what's happened here, if he's escaped from Glowworm and there's no craziness involved and it's just him, this could just be a character turn for him, and taking a different approach now that things turned out the way that they did. But realistically, something weird spiritually must have happened to him, being that close to a spirit for who knows how long. In that this was a spirit that was clearly taking him for like a price in blood. So what happened along the way? Did Glowworm try and influence Yoon in some way to do that? Did we get spirit morphing going on here along the lines of like a Tokuga type thing, but perhaps not with any physical stuff going on? That might help to explain the kind of increased power level type thing, why he's able to just like counter Janzu and Kyoshi's earthbending. Um, that's one way to do it, because I suppose like we know that like a spirit, like through Rava basically, that spirit plus human increases the power of bending. So that's one way you could view it, because like Tokuga in Turf Wars was so much more powerful after being spirit morphed, and he wasn't even a bender. So if a bender got infected in this way, that would be an interesting approach. Um, and yeah, it all goes back to Glowworm. I assume Kyoshi will want to investigate him, and we'll find out what happened there. Did like Yun fight his way out and free himself from Glowworm, or what? I'm not sure, but what's your speculation on what's happened to Yoon? Do you think it's spiritual, or is it more of a character arc thing, character change?
That's a good one. I mean, I would think it could be part of both. I mean, like you mentioned, it definitely seemed like once he became the one who really wasn't the Avatar, definitely seemed like sort of the his sort of character sort of being from the past whatever 7 9 or whatever years, it would take a toll. It definitely would have a change effect on him. But just the way that they sort of describe him as sort of being this sort of like otherworldly being, sort of being repulsed by everyone else, makes me think that there's something spiritual that sort of happened to him, and not the good way, that sort of has tainted or changed him in some sort of way. So, and Kyoshi, she even mentions that she's going to have to sort of, figure that out, but she hasn't really mentioned that to anyone. So I don't know. I mean, there would only be so many people, left around that would even be able to sort of, really have that much of a strong sort of like connection with Yoon, sort of like directly, and they're sort of not together at this point. So it'll be interesting to see if Kyoshi sort of goes about this on her own, sort of way of figuring these out. So no, I think Yoon is probably one of the more interesting parts that I think that they're going to have to, discuss in some way in the next book, just because of, how much, time they spent on him in the beginning. Even if, by the end of the book, you almost sort of like forget about him, but he was, really important. I mean, the whole rest of the world, probably still knows of him as the Avatar, and he's not even around.
Yes, and I think that sort of links into what I think most of the book is going to be about. And I think it's one of the few things that's been said in interviews by FCE about the next book, is that it will be Kyoshi getting involved in the more political side of being the Avatar. And I think that means meeting people like the Earth King, Fire Lord potentially, and that sort of thing. So her as the Avatar in this book has been all like Dao Fei stuff. She's been able to just go into towns, kind of do whatever she wants, but now she's going to be forced into dealing with that sort of political side of things, which you very much get the impression she really doesn't have any time for. She doesn't want to be involved in that sort of stuff. I think the Dao Fei influence on her is going to be like a very important thing, in terms of she's not going to be particularly interested in dealing with a lot of the people in power and their politicking, the likes of Jianzhu and so on, and especially if they really do get into the Earth King to set up the later issue with the peasant uprising and so on. That could be a pretty big one, in terms of I it has to pretty much be the same Earth King as is in that story, and I'd lean more towards like, yeah, they probably shouldn't get on at all, pretty much, and set up that idea, because I like the idea of Kyoshi taking the approach of not really caring all that much about, maintaining amazing relationships with the world leaders, because that was almost like her attitude towards things, in terms of describing why she wore the full war paint going into her fight with Jianzhu, is that like this is who she is now. She doesn't really care in a way what people think of her, and I think that that's going to be her approach to world leaders as well, just because of, I suppose, how much she's suffered in a way because of nobles politicking and so much. But what's your thoughts on that? How do you think they're going to handle Kyoshi taking on that diplomatic role as the Avatar, and of course having to, I assume, meet the Earth King and the all those people who were on the Jianzhu side of the story for this book, but now she's going to have to interact with them.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely going to be something that's going to have to play a pretty sort of large role. And yeah, like you said, her whole sort of Dao Fei sort of influence and just her personality in general. It didn't seem like she really, she either wanted to be sort of like unnoticed, or now she's at the point where she just doesn't really sort of like care about it at all. And we know how she deals with Chin the Conqueror later on. So just knowing that little tidbit, and how she sort of acts, almost at this point now, you definitely can see that she's not going to have, the greatest set of patience for sort of the politics and the policies of things that's going to go along. I mean, I'm guessing that she'll probably have, hopefully she'll have someone else in her group who will probably sort of like nudge her into the better way of sort of doing things. I mean, at least it seems like she's going to confront those things rather than sort of like with Karuk and just sort of let everything go to the wayside, or let sort of his friends sort of deal with everything in sort of those sort of engagements as they mentioned throughout the book, which I think was interesting just to see how different avatars deal with those sort of situations. So she'll be there. She just probably won't take any sort of time or day with most of these people unless it sort of affects her sort of like directly. So it'll be interesting to see what she does with like Yokoya and sort of what that turns out later on, depending on how far into the future that they deal with things. So I think, there's a lot of different things that that we know of, or that she will have to deal with over her whole time. So that's just another interesting aspect of the next book in general, is just how they're going to go about sort of picking these sort of incidents and sort of elements of her story, and how they're going to weave them all together in the length that they have for the next book.
Yeah, because Kyoshi does effectively own like that mansion in Yokoya and the structure that is most of the sort of power in Yokoya. So it sort of sets up, I suppose, the idea of like why eventually this place will come to be known as like Kyoshi Island. I suppose we don't really know if like prior to that it was known as like Kyoshi Village, or like there was a name transition at some point and it just went to be known as the island, or it was only changed after the island. But still, that seems like another setup thing that they're going to have to do, of like, what way does Kyoshi view Yokoya, given that she sort of earlier on in the book said that it could never be home again for her, but now she has a house there, but it's Jianzhu's house, and how does she view all that stuff? I don't think she'll have too much of a problem with that, because like her entire look is just items from people that she's hated in the past, like her parents and Jianzhu and so on. So that's going to be an interesting one. Plus, I suppose just how they use the cast of this book, and that Kirima, Wong is still out there. Rangi, I suppose, very importantly, and Heiran are going to be interesting, because Heiran is now the only surviving member of like Karuk's team, and that could be sort of interesting, because like she didn't really interact all that much with Kyoshi, so you'd hope that she recovers and gets to interact more with her. And then how do they do Kyoshi and Rangi's relationship going forward? Given that we know at some point Kyoshi has a daughter named Coco. Now, they could go down the route of that being like an adopted daughter or something like that, I'm not sure. But there's that could need setup, which could go anyway in terms of there was the previous sort of romance with Yoon. If that's always a thing they could go back to, depending on what way they go with things. And beyond that, there's so much they could do. I'm not really sure how exactly they're going to do it with regards to like, is Rangi just immediately going to be around Kyoshi for like most of this book again, or will they take a while to get to that? I suppose, what's your take on that? Like, how big of a role do you think Rangi will play in the second book?
I don't know. That's interesting, because I mean, at least at the start of it, we know that they're going to be fairly far away from each other. So that whole idea of the distance is definitely something to be considered. But I'm guessing, Kyoshi has, an air bison or will get, ping ping back. So, she can probably travel, larger distances rather quickly than, they might have been able to do otherwise. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it all depends on where she's at. Like if her mother, it seems like she's pretty committed to her mother being healed. So if she has to stay in the Northern Border Tribe for, an extended period of time, then the whole idea of them having a relationship is obviously going to be kind of hard to manage. So I don't know. It'll definitely be something to see. I mean, I don't know. I would hope that, at some point they would get sort of like the group back together and they would, whatever, the current goal that Kyoshi has or conflict or issue that she has to deal with would be something that, they're able to sort of do as together. But, just knowing how long Kyoshi lives in general and just the different beats of her life, the group, of course, obviously can't be together as long as Kyoshi's around because she lives quite a long time unless they figure it out the same way. I mean, I guess maybe Lao Ji could be around for extended period of time. So that would be interesting to see how he works in the group if they do all get them back together. Just know how Kyoshi feels about what he does, considering her being the Avatar. So that's just another a conflict of possibly interest that she might have to deal with.
Yeah, I think Lao Ji is going to be an interesting one because they could go anyway with him because of just the weird character that he is. At times he's frustrated by her. At times he seems like he's happy with her progress. He's this master assassin, but he's also like this wise guru character. Um, and yeah, like the fact that he sort of jokes about putting her on his list, like I could see a situation where they have to face off. That he he has to maybe assassinate someone that Kyoshi has to protect or something like that, and they have to have that fight because otherwise, like the question is like, why isn't Lao Ji like around in Avatar or Korra if he can live that long? So something happens to him along the way, and how exactly does that go? Um, so I can see so many different directions with him. Uh, I I probably don't see it getting down to the point where like Kyoshi has to kill him, but it almost kind of feels like he'd be the sort of character to like put her up to that test of like you disagreed with me on who to kill before, now it's kill me or you die type thing. What are your thoughts on what they'll do with Lao Ji across the second book?
I don't know. That's he can really go any sort of way with just his character in general and sort of how sort of out there he is. I mean, yeah, I mean it's interesting. Why isn't he around, or why don't we know of him being around later on? Or maybe he's just sort of so much in the background that we sort of have, there's no reason for him to sort of stand out, or maybe he is there in sort of another form and we just haven't sort of realized him. I don't know. I think that would be an interesting sort of, tidbit if that did sort of turn out to be that way. But no, I mean, I think his character overall can go so many different ways just because of how he views the world and how he sort of integrated himself into it. I don't know. Maybe he's at the point where he decides that he doesn't need to sort of be around anymore and sort of stop sort of his sort of reign of sort of immortality. I don't know. I think that would be definitely a big point to make if they did sort of go that route with his character.
hmm And then the final thing for me is just I really wonder how this second book, given that it is the last Kyoshi book, how it
Hmm.
will tackle, in a way, kind of having to be one of the last takes on Kyoshi's life. So if there's anything about Kyoshi, they kind of have to say it here for the most part. So she lives such a long time. Like obviously, I think most of the book is going to be her pretty at the age similar, maybe just a year or two past the end of this book. So Kyoshi at like 16, 17, 18 or something like that. I really wonder, and I think it's probably my biggest question is, towards the end of this book, will they at all decide to montage through her life or cut to a point later in her life to show other moments that we don't know about yet? Because I think I still, as much as I love these books along the way, this one was fantastic, even though it just dealt with her during this like one year, this one couple of weeks, months span, I still do want to see the kind of wider scope of her life. So do you think that the book will or won't kind of do that sort of stuff of like show her at this point and then this point and then show her at like 200 plus or whatever?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that definitely would be a cool thing for them to do. I don't know. I wonder how that would work, sort of like story wise. I mean, if they have, we know they have a couple specific sort of plot threads that we hope that they'll sort of cover, and I would suspect that that would take, a good portion of the book. But yeah, we do know these other sort of specific, very specific parts of her story that, definitely could use more detail. And I'm sure that, with the people behind the book, that there's something that they could do and it could actually feel, like right, like it'll be, part of the universe as is. So I don't know. I definitely would hope that they would do it. I mean, I don't know. I could see them doing it as sort of like an epilogue type thing, but I would hope, I don't know. I could see them if they did like, sort of like the cleaning up of sort of like the plot threads that we know from this book and sort of like say the first half or first 2/3, and then from there sort of take like a jump in time to sort of other sort of key elements of her story that we know of. I think that potentially that could work to good effect if they chose to go that route, because otherwise it does seem like there's just so much that they wouldn't really have the time to get through in one book.
Yeah, like I think especially now that they've directly set up Kyoshi is doing the longevity exercises with the meditation, it would be kind of weird if the book then never showed a scene of her having succeeded to a point that is like in her life that is like only a result of that longevity exercises. So that will be where like even if it is just one scene right at the end, the epilogue or the final book is just we could have had, and it's like 200-year-old Kyoshi just reflecting on, the last 100 years of her life or something like that. Like there's a long period of time to cover with her. So, um, because as much as like I think even like Mike and FCE have both said that like, oh, we know so much about Kyoshi when she's older. We don't really, because like all of those incidents pretty much happen like right one after the other. Like the formation of the Kyoshi warriors from the comic shells is a very like low key thing ultimately. It's not much of an incident. The Chin the Conqueror thing deserves more story, I think, because of what's going on there, and they sort of have set it up here with the whole this is how the people of Chin view things. And then the peasant uprising bossing say, I assume we'll have to get some setup with the Earth King, but will they go beyond that? And like I said, Coco, I'd like that to be fully clarified if they're committing to that being that's something that's 100% canon, or if they're just going to say that was just Avatar extras, that was one of the things it just made up. It's not really the case. That's the sort of stuff that I want to know. But yeah, that's our discussion on the rise of Kyoshi. I assume there'll be more to say as we get like more information about the next book and stuff like that. But yeah, I think we did a good job covering the book across these 3 episodes of the podcast. But yeah, that's the end of the episode. It's been myself and Greg. Thanks for listening, and bye.
Bye bye.